Welcome to today's Salt Lake City Council meeting for February 20th, 2024. Our meetings are public, and you're welcome to join us in person or by watching from the Council's agenda page, Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, or SLC TV. We hope you'll continue to join us in whichever manner you feel most comfortable. This is a work session meeting during which there is no public comment. Please join us tonight during our 7 p.m. formal meeting to share your comments. We, of course, welcome your feedback anytime by mail to P.O. Box 145476, Salt Lake City, Utah 84114, 5476, by email at council.comments@slcgov.com, or via our 24-hour phone comment line 801-535-7654. Comments we receive on agenda topics are shared with council members and posted to our website, slccouncil.com. We will now begin our work session, and the first item on the agenda is informational updates from the administration. We've got Chimali Hernandez Garcia here, and online I hear we have Andrew Johnston. Hi, Chimali.
Good afternoon, council members. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. Let's dive right into the administrative updates. Next slide, please. Just as a general reminder, residents are encouraged to engage on projects live in the city through the community engagement highlights link. Current feedback surveys include Livable Streets and Jordan River Stories, making the Emerald Ribbon. Next slide. A few updates from planning. Firstly, allowing project signs in all commercial and mixed-use districts. The Planning Commission has recommended the adoption of the proposal. Second, prohibiting demolition of housing for parking. This proposal is a part of the process to replace the housing loss mitigation ordinance. The Planning Commission has tabled this zoning text amendment to clarify how it would apply to development that is otherwise allowed. Lastly, for planning, modifications to the Planning Commission and Historic Landmark Commission. The petition to modify the minimum number of commissioners that are necessary for the Planning Commission and Historic Landmark Commission to hold a public meeting or public hearing. And a hearing for this is scheduled on March 13th. In regards to public lands, since the last workshop in November, Public Lands has used feedback to collect and develop proposed themes for the Jordan River and the Emerald Ribbon Master Plan. On March 13th and 14th, residents and folks are invited to weigh in on these proposed themes to help guide the future of the Jordan River. And this feedback will be used to create the final version of the Emerald Ribbon Master Plan. Next slide, please. And with regards to Love Your Block, our applications open March 1st and they run till March 31st, at least for the mini grants. We have application assistance sessions, one in the ballpark area and one on the west side, on March 14th and 5th. Though further information can be found on our website, which is finally up to date. You can scan the QR code or just look up Salt Lake City Love Your Block. Next slide, please. And our community office hours this month, we've held 2 so far and have 5 opportunities to meet with the outreach team from the mayor's office for folks to continue discussing key issues and hotspots in their neighborhoods. And that is all. Andrew Johnston is online if you all have any questions regarding homelessness.
All right, I don't think, from what I understand, the statistics this week are the same as last week, and I don't think we're going to have a formal from Andrew unless any of you have specific questions. Yes, Councilmember Young.
I have a question, and it can be answered in a future setting, but I would like to know what the process and timeline is going to be in terms of wrapping up the current camping that the city has allowed. I know as we get closer to that due date, I think we were hoping to have a more formal plan in partnership with the state. Just curious for an update on where we are related to those conversations.
Andrew, is that something best answered now, or should we do it at a later date?
I'm happy to give an initial answer now, maybe some timelines for you. The micro shelter project was identified to be a temporary project that would last through, I believe, May by temporary land use resolution. The intention was that would lead into a second phase on state-owned property starting about that time this year. The Office of Homeless Services of the state is right now working with the legislature, obviously, on funding appropriations. Those funding appropriations could have an impact on that timeline. And so they're waiting till probably the end of the session to know what they have for funding and therefore what is feasible and what the time frame will be. So we can have some more detailed discussions in a couple of weeks when we get more information from them about what their resources look like.
Great. I would appreciate that. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Councilmember Young. Any other council members? Just a reminder to any constituents who may be engaged that the homelessness appropriation is still up, and you are also constituents of the state and have every right and power to communicate with them how important the funding would be towards solving some homelessness issues. Thank you for being here, Andrew. All right, we'll move on now to our second item of business, the ordinance around the Yale Crest Princeton Heights Local Historic District. Brian Fulmer from Council will be here, as well as Lex Trauber from the Planning Department.
This proposal would create the Princeton Heights Local Historic District on Princeton Avenue between approximately 1300 East and 1500 East in Council District 6. The council will require a briefing on the adjacent proposed Laird Heights Local Historic District 2 weeks ago. The council briefing, public hearing, and vote are the final steps to create a new local historic district. The petitioner is with us and would appreciate an opportunity to address the council, and I'll turn it over to Lex.
Good afternoon. This is very similar to what we heard 2 weeks ago. Next slide, please. This is for the Princeton Heights Local Historic District. This is a map of the district in that kind of salmon color there. This is just to the north of the Laird Heights district that you heard a couple weeks ago. Next slide. This is just another map showing you the relation of those proposed districts. The one in the pink is the one we're here talking about today, and the one in the yellow is the one that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Next slide, please. We have been through this process. We are now at stage number 9. I need new bifocals. Where you are being asked to make a decision regarding this request. Next slide, please. This request does meet the zoning ordinance standards for map amendments, and a local historic district is a zoning ordinance map amendment. Next slide. It also meets many adopted policies and various policy documents that have been adopted for Salt Lake City. This was heard by both the Historic Landmark Commission and the Planning Commission, and both of those bodies voted to forward a positive recommendation regarding this request. Next slide, please. This is the official canvas, and you can see that it was overwhelmingly positive in terms of the vote from the property owners, and they do meet the criteria of at least 2/3 of the property owners needed to respond, representing 50% of the total property owners on that street. This one hit about 81%, so it meets the standard. Next slide. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have regarding this proposal.
Thanks, Lex. Council members, any questions? Councilmember Dugo.
Thank you very much, Lex. Appreciate that. So there's really not much difference between, the results and the outcome and the from the last 2 weeks ago was very similar.
Very similar.
Very similar. And the same thing about, there's almost all the properties are contributing with just those 2 empty lots, and I think one house or something of that nature.
When we say vacant lots, they're not buildable.
Oh, I saw that in another report that
Yeah,
they're vacant, but they're not buildable, so
They're
really,
not. They're either associated with a property owner adjacent, or in one case, there's a little sliver of property. I think it was probably to accommodate an existing garage that had encroached on a neighbor's property.
Okay.
And that's the same thing for Laird Heights. There are no vacant buildable parcels.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Councilmember Wharton?
I just wanted to disclose again that my husband is a supporter of this and helped as a volunteer, wasn't paid for anything. We also don't live in the neighborhood, but so it's not a conflict, but just wanted everyone to know.
Thank you. I'm real thrilled at the possibility of this, especially since I had the chance to meet with the petitioners and love their vision for preservation as part of our growing landscape here in the city, and making sure that we're preserving all the stories throughout the city, and their offer to even lend help in other areas. So I'm eager to see this application. Anyone else? Anything? All right. Thank you for your time. Oh, sorry. Petitioner would like to come up. Sorry. I was just going to let us all off the hook easy.
So I have the option to make a comment for 5 minutes.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Paula Harleen. I'm the primary applicant for the proposed Yale Crest Princeton Heights Local Historic District designation. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I plan to focus on neighborhood equity in Salt Lake City. A couple of months ago, one of the planning commissioners asked me to explain why there aren't LHD designations on the west side. That question made me think deeper about density, diversity, and compassion. I think there are some misconceptions about historic preservation that I want to. Misconception number one is that Princeton Heights is opposed to all forms of density. We are aware of the housing crisis. We see it on our block, where houses are adding additional family members, including my husband and me. Yale Crest has 118 home rentals, 61 duplexes, 1 3-plex, 2 4-plexes, 1 5-plex, 1 6-plex, and 1 9-unit apartment building. On our block, there are ADU units above garages and basement rentals that have traditionally housed students, given our proximity to the U and Westminster. Under the new zoning ordinances the council enacted, one of my neighbors is already building a new garage that includes 2 exterior ADUs, and I assume that there will be more to come on our street. Although this petition seeks to preserve the 42 all-original houses on our block, this doesn't mean that we oppose efforts to allow more diversity. Misconception number 2, Princeton Heights opposes diversity. I estimate that our street is 80% white, and according to the last census, Salt Lake City is 71% white. We see that this is not equitable and it's not right. We want to help close the gap. We see a local historic designation as a tool in that effort, because when a house in our neighborhood is torn down, it's replaced with a larger, more expensive, oversized house. In Yale Crest, there have been 67 teardowns of historic homes, reducing our stock of middle-class housing. By preserving smaller historic homes, we are maintaining parts of our city's attainable housing stock, making our street available to a more diverse pool of potential buyers. Misconception number 3, this is the last one. Princeton Heights lacks compassion for other neighborhoods. Since becoming active in my neighborhood, I've found that rather than getting tired, I am energized to move beyond Yale Crest, and I am actively seeking ways to do this. In my view, here are ways that local historic districts can help the city reach its goals. First, in preparation for the Olympics, we want to show off a city we're proud of. Economic research shows that cultural heritage tourists tend to stay longer, spend more, and travel more often. Every city council district should have at least one LHD with homes and small businesses. As Councilmember Lopez Chavez pointed out, Salt Lake City has a unique immigration history. Visitors want to know how people live locally. How did a place founded by LDS pioneers grow to include other religious and ethnic communities in places like Swedetown, Greektown, Japantown, and other neighborhoods? Where did our ideal of equity for all fail, as some neighborhoods were redlined? Where can we add public art to help define placemaking? Our stories are told through buildings and art which shape our cultural landscape, and they are worth preserving. Second, if LHGs are designated, some homeowners need funds to assist them in maintaining landscapes. It would be great if a neighborhood like Yalecrest could help raise funds and generate interest in other historic neighborhoods. Third, a Preservation Utah board member recently told me that there is interest in Rose Park as a site for their annual architectural home tour, which could create momentum for a local historic district there, and I'd like to help with this. There are lots of possibilities out there. In conclusion, our local economy depends on us being a unique place to visit. People don't want to see the same generic thing where everything has the same boxy shape with the same materials, and where you look around and don't know what city you're in. According to preservationist Nathaniel Tesoro, the places that maintain their urban character and their respectful relationship to the land will have tremendous economic advantage. It's important to not only save my street, but neighborhoods and shops throughout the city established by waves of different people. This effort will help us prepare for the Olympics, help instill pride in our neighborhoods, and make Salt Lake City a lively and unique place to visit.
Thank you so much. Council, any comments for the petitioner?
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Chair, I just wanted to say thanks again to the petitioners. They did take quite a bit of time to answer our questions and be very thorough about how this new historic district expansion could help serve all residents of Salt Lake City. And if we look back, there's a beautiful history in Yalecrest, so I appreciate you taking the time to speak with each of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. And I just really appreciate council members giving me feedback and talking with our group. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, we will move on to our next item of business, which is a rezone at approximately 756 South Montgomery Street. Brian Fulmer will retain his seat at the table, and Kelsey Lindquist from Planning will join him.
Thank you. This is a proposal to amend the zoning map at the address you mentioned. It's an approximately half-acre city-owned parcel in Council District 2. It's currently zoned R1 5000 or single-family residential, and the proposal is to amend the zoning map to RMF 30 or low-density multifamily residential. The change would allow additional density on the site, and with that, I'll turn it over to Kelsey.
Thank you. We can skip this slide since Brian covered a little bit of my presentation. Next slide. Perfect. So I would just add to the description that Brian provided that the property was acquired in 2014 by the city, and it currently is in the portfolio of the Housing Stability Division. And their long-term goal for the property is to further develop it into affordable housing. Next slide, please. The surrounding context is primarily characterized by single-family homes, and the zoning is primarily R1 5000. There is a non-conforming commercial plant nursery across from the street to the east, and to the north is a mobile home park, which is zoned MH, which is Mobile Home Park District. The property is situated to the north of Montgomery Street, where it dead ends into the perimeter wall of the mobile home park. Next slide. This slide provides the comparison between R1 5000 and RMF 30. RMF 30 is intended to be a transitional district from a lower density residential, such as R1 5000. It does allow for greater intensity of development, excuse me, than the R1 5000, but maintains similar development standards. For example, the RMF 30 allows 30 feet in height compared to 28 feet in the R15. There is slightly higher building coverage in the RMF 30, 50 compared to 40%, and the main difference between the two is the number of units that can be achieved. Under the RMF 30, 8 units would be possible for multifamily or cottage-style development, or 6 units as a sideways townhouse development. Next slide. The proposal is generally supported by the applicable planning documents, and Planning Commission did forward a positive recommendation on this. Next slide. I can answer any questions at this time.
Thank you, Kelsey. Council, any questions, comments? Councilman Verdugan?
So it's still, this is just the zoning side of the house, but is the idea about the city owning the property and selling the houses like the community land trust house? Do we have any thoughts on that, or?
That would be a question for housing stability, since this property is in their portfolio.
Okay. And that same thing, whether it's rent or for sale, was still part of that discussion, and size of the units?
Yeah, that would be up to them.
Okay, because I'd love to have it for sale if the community land trust, where they lease the land and they.
We still need a lot of rental over in our area too, though.
Okay.
We have a lot of people in our area who don't have deposits saved up to
Okay.
buy. So we could inadvertently do displacement if we weren't strategic about balancing for sale and for rent in my neighborhood.
Perfect. Great. Thanks.
Well, technically in Councilmember Pui's neighborhood, but when you're on the west side, it all runs together. Anyone else? All right, thank you so much. We're running really ahead of schedule. So the next thing is the water and snowpack report. Laura, I have that you, Jesse, and John are all going to be here. Do you need time for the rest of your team to get here?
I think we'll be here soon.
He's here, he'll be back in just a second.
Okay. Well, if you want to come up, and then we can begin when he gets to the table. It's our fault that we're being efficient today. Everything else is just flowing.
All right. Good afternoon. I think we have a presentation to show. There we go. I do have John Wells here. He's our hydrologist for public utilities. John has a really awesome job where he gets to go out and measure snowpack, sometimes on skis, and a lot of our stream gauges, and he knows the area very, very well. And he's here to provide us some additional details should there be questions. But I will just go right into our 2024 water supply outlook. Next slide, please. So I usually, on our water supply outlook, try to include, for those who may not know, the water service area of Salt Lake City. We serve more residents than just within Salt Lake City boundaries. So the map here shows in the light blue Salt Lake City boundaries where we serve water, sewer, storm, and street lighting services. And then in the purple area, which encompasses Mill Creek, Holiday, Cottonwood Heights, and small portions of South Salt Lake, Murray, and Midvale, we serve water. That's more than 365,000 people. And welcome, Jesse, Deputy Director.
It's our fault. You're fine.
So we also post our water service area map on our website. In 2020, a trio of State legislation was adopted, including a constitutional amendment that requires us to show very specifically our water service area on our website. Next slide, please. So when we look toward the water year, which is April through October, we look at it with an eye of determining what our annual water supply projection might be. And at this time of year, while we have a little over a month prior to the start of the water year, we're looking at current conditions, and I've shown on this slide that we have good news this year. We have above normal snowpack in all of our watersheds. We don't have any listed drought in our region, and our soil moisture appears improved. All of that is indicative of an efficient and plentiful runoff for us. We also look at our 3-month outlooks, and we use a lot of different data sources for this, but the one that I'm showing on this slide is, well, I have the drought monitor and our snow water equivalent, but we also look at National Weather Service outlook, which shows for the next 3 months what our temperature and precipitation is projected to be. And that is also looking pretty good. I think that's on the next slide, actually. But our local Wasatch Mountain watersheds are looking very good at 98 to 100%, 112% of average for each of our watersheds. As a comparison, this time last year, we were at 123% to 193% of average, which then resulted in some elevated flood risk for our community. And again, we have a little over a month left prior to the water year, so we've got some time to either build or shrink snowpack. Next slide, please. I included this slide for Big Cottonwood Creek. We look at each of our streams in terms of what the historical production of those streams has been in terms of water, and also what our outlooks are. All of our watershed streams can be pretty variable. And Big Cottonwood Creek from the years 2022 to 2024 is no exception to that. Big Cottonwood Creek is an important water supply for us. It generates between 20 to 25% of our annual supply. In 2022, which is the chart on the left side of this slide, the annual yield of Big Cottonwood Creek was a little over 20.5 thousand acre feet, which was about 61% of average, and was the 11th lowest production in about 94 years of monitoring Big Cottonwood Creek. Then we moved over to last year, where we had the 9th highest production of that stream. And then this year, we're looking at just about in the center, about average. When I looked at the estimates for this year, we were number 48 out of the 94 years. So you can just see that the quantities and flow of all of our mountain streams can be quite variable year over year. And that's why we plan so far in advance with our water supply and demand plans. Next slide, please. So this is information from the National Weather Service, and this is that outlook for both temperature and precipitation. It's relatively good news, where our 3-month outlook for March, April, and May projects equal chances for above or below normal precipitation. So we could have just about average. We could have above or below, but we'll keep an eye out on that. The 3-month outlook for temperature, however, shows that we might be slightly higher than average. And the reason why these are important metrics for us is that higher temperatures can cause greater water demand in the spring. They can also cause a faster runoff if the temperatures increase at a higher rate during the spring. Conversely, more precipitation in the spring and early summer can lead to less water demand and more water conservation. Next slide, please. So we also look at our reservoir health right now. This is a schematic of the major reservoirs along the Wasatch Front. And the reservoir that is most important to us in terms of water storage is Deer Creek Reservoir. And that reservoir right now is sitting at 96% full. And we will likely see some releases into Utah Lake, into the Provo River and Utah Lake this year to make space in that reservoir. So that's a really good news. Also, Utah Lake, I don't have that in my bullet points here, but Utah Lake is an important reservoir for us as well. Yeah, and Utah Lake is 100% full. And actually, we've been releasing water from Utah Lake to the Jordan River. It's headed toward the Great Salt Lake right now. Deer Creek Reservoir is important to us because it represents about 30 to 35% of our annual water supply. But it's also important to us from a resiliency standpoint where its operation is to provide some water supply for us during year-over-year droughts. We were able to participate in the Deer Creek Reservoir as a partner, and through that have access to the Provo River Project and Central Utah Project water, and that's through our relationship with the Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy. We have smaller reservoirs in Parley's Canyon, that's Mountain Dell and Little Dell reservoirs. Currently, Mountain Dell is pretty much empty because we are still doing dam rehabilitation for that reservoir. And Little Dell Reservoir is sitting at a little over 15,000 acre feet. Is that right? Yes, 15,445 acre feet, and is 75% full. The Little Dell Reservoir is actually the larger reservoir, so it's located right near the beginning of State Route 65. And that reservoir is also used for flood control, and you all saw us exercising that reservoir last year as well. Depending on the snowpack, we may be doing releases from Little Dell Reservoir this year as well. So we'll be watching that. Next slide, please. Great Salt Lake. This is something that we watch closely every day. The current level is 4193.4 feet. That's an elevation level, not the depth of the lake. And that's an important number for us to watch. I included a schematic from the USGS related to what different lake levels mean to the health of the lake. And I won't go through all of those, but there are different metrics in terms of wetlands, biology, land use, recreation, economics, and safety. And on that schematic, you can see the dotted green vertical line that shows the current lake level. And you can see that for most metrics, the lake level is below what's optimal. And really where we want to be for Great Salt Lake is around 4198 feet or more for a more optimal lake level. Next slide, please. Water demand. The other side of our water supply and demand is water demand and conservation. Last year, our communities continued to conserve water at significant levels. The chart on the left of this slide shows in the light blue the water demand in the year 2000. In the red line, that depicts the average of water demand in 2020, 2021, and 2022. And then the area shaded blue was 2023's water demand. And you can see just from this schematic that we were below our last 3-year average. And I believe that was by about 5% over the last 3-year average, but we have to remember that the last 2 years, we were close to 20% below each of the last 3-year averages. So our conservation trend is really good. Water conservation is really important for our overall water resiliency. It's increasingly important to maintain and increase flows to Great Salt Lake. And while our water supplies look good for this year, so far, Great Salt Lake still remains in peril. And so we will be asking our community to continue to conserve water and take steps to be very efficient. And this is a really good opportunity for us. It's a relative time of plenty for us in terms of water supply this year. And it's a really good time for us to take advantage of that and let as much water go to Great Salt Lake as we can. Next slide, please. That might be my last slide, actually.
That's the last in our packet. So, thank you so much, Laura. Council members, Councilmember Young.
Thank you for the overview and kind of the update on where we are. I'm wondering, do we track what Salt Lake City watershed's contributions are to the Great Salt Lake? Is that a trend and a number that we have available?
Yeah. John, would you like to handle that question?
Yeah, we to a point we can always do a better job, and we're trying to do a better job. But we apply metrics to what we're using and what we're releasing back to the Great Salt Lake. The good majority of that comes from our water reclamation facility, and we have metrics on that.
Excellent. So the reason I ask is there are so many people across the city and in my district included that are really interested in making sure we're doing our part to be able to help the Great Salt Lake. And so I think just having access to those metrics to kind of understand that it's like when I choose not to water my lawn, I'm helping to contribute to the city being able to put more towards the Great Salt Lake, I think could help in terms of prompting action. I'm a competitive person by heart. And so if you give me a goal, like, if we can all, save X cubic feet or however it's being measured, that means Salt Lake City can do that much more for the Great Salt Lake. I think it could be an opportunity to really not just educate, but also motivate action.
Right. I think that one of the best ways to do that's on your water bill, right? That's as far as whether you're competitive or not, you're going to notice a difference on how much you're using, how much you're not. And the graphic that Laura showed really showed that everybody's trying to do a good job of conserving.
Thank you, Councilmember. Anyone else? Councilmember Wharton.
Thanks. So I'm always really encouraged by these reports, and when I'm talking to people in the community or sometimes people that are thinking about moving to Salt Lake City, they're always really surprised at how good we are at managing water for the future. And even though we're seeing unprecedented growth, we're using less water because we're becoming more conscious about the way that we use it. What else would you tell people when they're saying, oh, I'm afraid that either I'm a resident here and I feel like I'm going to have to move from Salt Lake because we're not going to have water, or I want to move to Salt Lake, but I've read these headlines about the Great Salt Lake. I'm afraid that there's not going to be water there. What would you say to people that have those fears?
Yeah, I'll say, first of all, that there is definitely a very strong ethic of water stewardship and conservation, and that spans back more than 100 years in Salt Lake City. I have a lot of optimism with respect to Great Salt Lake, and the basis of that optimism is just how many different stakeholders within the Great Salt Lake Basin, which is huge, have come together to find solutions. And even in this legislative session, seeing the amount of policy, significant policy changes that are occurring in order to solve this problem. So I think there's a reason to have a lot of optimism. And then the final reason for optimism is that we are long-term planners. We plan for water supply and demand for the next 40, 50, 60 years. And we update those long-term plans every 5 years. And so we are constantly looking ahead, looking at what our risks and vulnerabilities are and taking steps to mitigate those. I think we probably have one of the best long-term water resource planning track records in the state.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Pui?
Just a quick question related to releasing water from the Utah Lake. I learned about this a couple weeks ago, and I wonder if there is any information they share with organizations that work along the Jordan River, especially to those that are helping the unsheltered community. The last thing we want is something to happen there. I want to know if there is a connection there. If not, yeah, it seems like there might be.
Yeah, currently there are definitely avenues to share with the community. The Jordan River Commission actually just formed the Jordan River Watershed Council, which watershed councils were formed statewide after not last legislative session, but the session before that. And the point of these watershed councils is to actually make more information available to communities, and Jordan River Commission is very well situated to do so because they have so much connection with the communities along the Jordan River. But I think also we've been sharing some of that information. And do you have an update on what's been released from Utah Lake?
Yeah, so releases started a couple weeks ago. We're working very closely with the Utah Lake Water Users Association, the Lower Jordan Commissioner, the Upper Jordan Commissioner, as well as Salt Lake County Flood Control. So right now, there are about 480 to 500 plus CFSs coming out. That's probably going to go up over the next several months as we get more releases from the Deer Creek Jordanelle system. In Salt Lake City, a lot of that water is going to go down the Surplus Canal. The Surplus Canal has a lot of capacity. Most of the capacity for the Jordan River goes down that to keep any issues happening in the lower Jordan below 21st South. So that will be continuing to go on, and we can provide updates as things progress.
So the additional water is going mostly to the Surplus Canal. Okay. My follow-up question, and this might seem very random, but I've been on the river picking up garbage quite often. There's, a lot of it. And I was just wondering if the increase of water helped push some of that, and if someone is grabbing it before it gets to what is harder to grab.
Yeah, I think I'm sure it did take some off as it comes up. If there's stuff along that lower shoreline, it's going to get mobilized down. That would be picked up either at various dams along the way, or there's a dam out in Davis County that a lot of that would be picked up at. Yep.
All right. Can I ask a clarifying question on the second to last slide where we have the safety metrics indicated? The last one is safety. Yeah. What does safety comprehend in this context? Is that like the dust that's being kicked up? What specifically? It's clearly not safe for birds, brine shrimp, or mammals right now, according to this. Yeah. What else is comprehended?
I'm not sure if it includes the dust, but it is human safety on the lake.
On the lake or adjacent to? Are we talking about the safety to our west side neighborhoods predominantly, or?
That's a really good question. I'll look back on that metric.
Thank you. I'd love to know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can see at the other end of the spectrum, it gets less safe when there's more water.
And it's so silly. Like it feels like, oh, that's just 20 more feet. We can do 20 feet. And then when you realize the magnitude of the space, But okay, thank you so much. Laura, anytime you and your team are optimistic, I'm going to maintain optimism, but proactivity. So thank you for your guidance and information to help us make good decisions about this. So
thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, Council, I was going to have to give us an early break, except the entire economic development team got here, so we're just going to keep going. So, Thank you all. We're going to talk about the resolution authorizing the transfer of the Foreign Trade Zone Authority. Lorena Rifo Jensen is coming with Peter Makowski, and we'll also see Jonathan Friedman, the CEO of the World Trade Center. And there's a few, and they don't even give us our staff member on here. Can you imagine?
I'm sure you have the power, Madam Chair.
Can you imagine? Thank you for being here, Allison. And we got more World Trade Center groupies too, so thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll do a quick introduction. This resolution would authorize the council support for transferring Salt Lake City's Foreign Trade Zone, or FTZ, grantee authority to the World Trade Center, or WTC, Utah. That's a bunch of technical language that we will explain. The program is run by the U.S. Department of Commerce to encourage economic activity and job growth by allowing businesses located in designated zones to access delayed or reduced duty payments on foreign merchandise. The city does not have the ability to approve this transfer, but the administration is asking for council support of its request to the National FTZ Board to take advantage of WTC Utah's staff capacity and resources. And this would be on the agenda for potential council action on March 5th. I will turn it over to the Director of Economic Development.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see everyone. I won't take a lot of your time because our council chair is finding our meeting so tight that I want to respect that. With that, I think this is a great opportunity for us to do something that makes a lot of sense with the World Trade Center Utah having the staff, and we look forward to ensuring that our Salt Lake City companies have more access, just because FTC, often the consultants are quite expensive, and we want to make sure we provide more opportunities for our companies. So with that, I'm going to let Peter just quickly talk about just a brief summary of the Foreign Trade Zone, and then we should extend the time to the CEO of the WTC Utah, Jonathan Friedman.
All right, thank you, Lorena. If we can move to the next slide, please. So our Foreign Trade Zone 30 was approved in May of 1977. It was grantee status was given to the city. As Allison mentioned, just a brief overview of the program. It allows companies to either reduce taxes and duties on imported product. This program serves a 60-mile, 90-minute drive time radius. So any company within that radius, the center of it being around Salt Lake City International Airport, has access to this program. In 2007, our department applied for what was called Alternative Site Framework, which streamlined the process for applying for the program, which made it easier for companies to engage. Some of our past operators have been Cabela's, Scott Sports, and Red Wing Shoes, and we currently have an active subzone with Specialized Bicycle Components. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our current operator, Specialized Bicycle Components, they are a bicycle manufacturer, very popular. They started their subzone in 2021, and we're currently working with them on a new location out near the Salt Lake International Airport, and we're hoping to have that finalized this year. And then Albion Minerals, a company from Ogden, has been in the application process for the last couple of years now. Their application's very complex, and they continue to move forward on that. Next slide, please. Thanks. So next steps in the future of the zone, we are providing support for the transfer of the Foreign Trade Zone grantee status to the World Trade Center. We think that this is an appropriate move for the program moving forward. This doesn't change our access to the program. Salt Lake City companies still will have their access to the program, but World Trade Center is better positioned to administer this, since it is a more regional program and can be utilized by companies outside of Salt Lake City. They're also, from a capacity standpoint, which Allison mentioned, they're in a more advantageous position with more staff, less reliance on outside consultants to engage in the program. A lot of that can be brought in-house, as well as marketing the program to companies. It's a very complex tool, and marketing it to companies for use does take some special attention due to the nature of the program. And we're excited, obviously, about World Trade Center's support of engaging diverse-owned businesses in this program and how they can utilize support their business. With that, I'll pass it off to Jonathan.
Sure. Maybe we'll take a step back. First of all, thank you for having me, council members. I appreciate being here and be able to talk about the Foreign Trade Zone. World Trade Center Utah is a private nonprofit organization, and we exist to help Utah companies grow internationally. That's our mission. And so this tool is a way that we feel we can best support Salt Lake City entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs across the state do that. It gives them a competitive advantage that they would not have otherwise. So I'm thrilled to be able to open this up so that it's fully utilized within the state. We appreciate the great partnership we've had with Salt Lake City for years. Salt Lake has a board seat on our board of advisors, and we just look forward to continuing that partnership and helping Salt Lake City and Utah companies grow.
Thank you so much. Council members, questions, concerns, thoughts? Okay, so my international studies policy dork heart is really excited about this and about the tool. I think this is amazing ability for us to weatherproof us against both domestic and international policies that might otherwise kneecap us. I love it as a tool for making sure that we're attracting the right kind of industry and right kind of employers. I know we're all in love with Stadler and some of the things that they've done for pushing forward apprenticeships and the ability for us to promote Salt Lake City as a center for international attention for employers that are going to raise the quality of life for our workers. That's super exciting. And the fact that we get to extend this gift and influence by partnering with World Trade Center throughout the state, and we can be an assistant to places like St. George and to other places. I love that it's, something that we can offer the state at large to make sure that we're not just growing in an explosive sense, but in a strategic way. So, Councilmember Pui.
Madam Chair, thank you. I'm excited about this. I think the synergy it fits better, and I'm excited to do this. I do like the idea of getting some reports,
Yes.
as it's noted on the document from the council. Some regular reports that can be written. That's okay. I would love to see what you guys are doing and how we can support. It's a big deal for our city that we're bringing this this jobs and this industry, this investment, and we're soon going to be the eyes of the we're going to have the eyes of the world here, hopefully for many hopefully Olympics and some other opportunities. So I'm looking forward to this, but I would love to request some regular reporting, and written reports is fine, and it could be just an email, right? But it would be nice to know what we're working on.
Councilmember Pui, we're fully committed to do that. I believe Jonathan and I would be happy to come and actually report before you. We can also provide you with a written report in terms of what has happened and what we're seeing in terms of the companies that we're attracting in order to make this tool readily available to more companies.
The work that you guys do attracting these good jobs, good paying jobs, and this economic development to the state is key for our community. So we love.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lopez Chavez.
Thanks. I just wanted to say that I'm in support of the FTZ because I think it further anchors Salt Lake City as a regional player, not just within our state, but in the surrounding states, which is, it's critical. This is what our constituency wants, and will serve them well long-term. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So I think we're pretty unanimously enthusiastic. Thank you all for showing up early.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I welcome the accountability, as you said, reporting, and I would be very happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're tracking well ahead of schedule, Council, but if you don't mind, I'm going to keep us on this path. There are a few other concurrent things happening this afternoon, and us being a little ahead of schedule works in all of our favor. So if you don't mind, we're going to keep pushing. All right, so then let's move on to the ordinance for landscaping and buffers, chapter text amendment follow-up. And we're going to invite Nanette Larson to the table, as well as my favorite and your favorite, Jen Bruno from the council office.
Thanks, Madam Chair. This is just another in a set of follow-up briefings on this landscape and buffers amendment chapter. There are several changes and clarifications that the council asked for during the last work session briefing, and so those have been included or addressed, and those are in the first page of the staff report. I'd say the last unresolved issue where I heard different questions and different ideas from council members is the issue of enforcement on folks who have already installed artificial turf, believing that they were doing the right thing for water conservation. Obviously, with artificial turf not being allowed in the current proposed version, those folks would be subject to enforcement unless the council makes a determination that you want to handle it a different way. So a couple of people have raised different ideas about how you could enforce, whether it's like a grandfathering date or some other sort of way to handle those folks. Separately, some council members asked about how many current enforcement cases or current properties with turf that we know of. While we don't have an inventory of every property with turf in the city, enforcement did let us know that they have about 45 open cases and 10 of those are related to artificial turf. Those are on pause right now as the administration has agreed that while we're working through these ordinance, they won't enforce, but those would be subject to enforcement. So it's about 10 properties. Additionally, public utility staff reached out to the Central Utah Water Conservancy District and to find out sort of the level of participation from Salt Lake City residents in that program. About 141 residents participated in that program in the last year. Only 2 related to artificial turf, and that was turf in backyards, and so that's not subject to enforcement in this ordinance. That said, it's not clear how many residents may have perceived that program helped them install artificial turf in years prior. They did clarify that since July 2023, the district has clarified with anyone that applies to them that they will reduce the reimbursement for removing grass based on the portion of grass that's replaced with artificial turf. So while they haven't sort of expressly said no turf whatsoever, they've adjusted that since July of 2023, although staff is still confirming, just based on anecdotal questions we've had from constituents. We're not sure, if the translation has always succeeded with that. So with that, I'll turn it over to either planning staff or council members if you have questions. There's not a specific presentation on this, but anyway.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Council. Just to clarify a few things about artificial turf. Right now, our current landscaping and buffers chapter prohibits artificial turf. It doesn't state it specifically, but an administrative interpretation did state that artificial turf is prohibited in required yard areas. So that would be the front yard, corner side yard, and buffer areas in the city. Like Jennifer was saying, the Central Utah Water Conservancy District did allow for artificial turf in the rear yard, and there's nothing in this proposed chapter or in our existing chapter that would prohibit artificial turf in the rear yard.
Thank you for the clarification. Council members, Councilmember Dugan.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Also on that same clarification about the this landscaping, I've seen also a number of homes that have just all rocks in the front yard. And was that also prohibited in the past? Because I just want to confirm that that was also prohibited in the
Correct.
past
Our
too.
current landscaping chapter requires 33% vegetation minimum right now in the front corner side yard.
Okay, and the second question, I think it's going to, Councilmember Pui brought it up yesterday about or last time with the park strips. You got a small park strip and the percentages of that. Did we adjust
Yeah,
that?
so that is in the most recent, the February 12th memo. We are proposing that park strips are measured cumulatively along street frontages. So if you have a corner lot with 2 street frontage, each frontage is measured cumulatively.
And that corner will be in which, the piece in the corner will be in which frontage?
So I suppose it would be with the definitions in our zoning ordinance. That corner piece would be split in between the 2 frontages.
Council members? Councilmember Wharton.
So it's 10 properties currently that have artificial turf. Do we know what the extent to which their belief in the city's pending changes played a role in them making those changes to the property?
I don't know that we can say that there's 10 properties with artificial turf, because those are just the 10 active cases that involve
that are
artificial turf.
With compliance.
Enforcement cases,
Yeah.
right? So where someone has reported that property, there may be several more that just haven't been enforced on because neighbors haven't turned them in. I think that anecdotally from the question, and this is anecdotally, so I'll just frame that, based on the questions that we've received from some constituents, I think several were making changes based on the anticipation that the city would allow artificial turf, just from the sense of saving water is a good thing, and not factoring in the chemical impacts that would have on the water supply. But that was not allowed in the zone at the time, and so I guess it was a risk.
And another thing to say about these 10 cases, the artificial turf cases right now, I believe these are enforcement cases that are on hold because of the rewrite of the landscaping chapter. Prior to the rewrite of the landscaping chapter, there were artificial turf cases that were enforced on, and artificial turf required to be removed.
And I think it was that basis that the basis of well-intentioned constituents that some council members had raised the idea of having just an install by date. If it was installed before, January of 2024, that would be allowed. I think some in CAN raised the concern that we'd have to figure out a way to make sure how to certify essentially when someone installed. But that was where that idea came from.
I just don't know what I'm trying to find the right thing to do, because as I said in previous meetings, we never said that we were going to make turf. I think even when I'm probably the one that has been the most outspoken on this issue and has pushed really hard for this issue, and I have said, let's look at whether it makes sense to remove that, or let's have that conversation. But I don't feel like we've ever said, this is the intention and this is the direction we're heading. I understand how that could have gotten confused, especially if companies were that were selling turf seized that opportunity. But I have a big issue exempting properties where it was never allowed. And then I also worry about whether it's fair for us to exempt a certain amount of properties that thought it was allowed because of, XYZ, where we've made others pay to remove the turf to come into compliance. So
Would you be
I want to do the right thing, but I just don't know what it is.
Would you be more at peace with like a sunsetting and a remediation plan? Since it's only 10, I thought it was going to be like, a couple hundred that would take up massive bandwidth. But if it's only 10, would you feel comfortable if we did remediation plans with those 10 and figured out?
No. I don't think there's what they're saying is we know about 10 right now. We would,
Started
and we're
with
only
that.
talking about a plan for those 10.
Right, but you're specifically talking about artificial turf. There are also a number of homes that have gravel throughout, which is just, maybe there's not the chemical side of it, but there's still the heat island index.
But we're specifically talking about the turf portion of this because of the damage that we've been educated it does to the soil and because of the chemicals and those other more nuanced issues. Yes, the heat island is stressful, but
it's also, but both of them are
problematic. But
yes, and both of them are not allowed.
But I think it would be more strategic for us to decide a sequenced strategy that would allow us to address this rather than to try to do an all at once. Maybe say this first one is the artificial turf and then with a legislative intent to follow up with the others at some point, or?
Yeah. I mean, and just like to state the obvious, like we have to draw the line somewhere and we have to make a decision somewhere. And whenever you draw a line, there's going to be situations on one side and situations on the other. I'm trying to find the most rational and the most, but also,
comprehensive and beneficial.
I'm sympathetic for people that kind of fell into this position or were maybe lured into this position. But at the same time, I'm always thinking about precedent, and if we create this precedent here, then the next precedent is going to apply to another public utility on another issue, and so I do we slam shut the box and we're going to crush a couple fingers, or do we wait for there to be multiple boxes that we have to slam shut and crush even more fingers? That's my concern.
Yeah. Where is the council on this so that they are not just taking one council member's concern? I think it would be kind for us to give them a little more comprehensive guidance.
Well, do you have any other thoughts or any other feedback for us on that issue, or is this? If you don't, it's okay. I'm not saying this is a hard problem. Why don't you tell me what to do? But I do want to say if you have any more input related to what I've said, I'd like to hear it before I say where I am, because I think I know, but.
I mean, Public Utilities isn't involved in the enforcement side of things, and so I'm sympathetic to setting precedent on zoning enforcement. I did express earlier that, I could understand and am empathetic with the confusion as we were going through this ordinance potentially. So I was just wondering if maybe we ought to put our heads together and see if we have a recommendation that balances those things depending on how the council feels.
I mean, I'm really loath to have you do another project like that. And I know that I've asked for things like that in the past as well. But, if there's any possibility that you could put just a little bit of time into that and come back to us with a recommendation. And I would also ask that I think it's important the attorney's office be involved with that, even though it's not like a binding precedent or something like that. I think that it would help to have to say, look, this is where it might get into a line of making other future situations even more blurry if we go into this territory.
Yeah. I like projects.
I know, but there's not a shortage is the thing. But yeah, for me, I'm like, where I'm leaning is that I know that I don't want to seem hard-hearted and saying like, we gotta, to go back to my slam the lid on the box analogy, like, I don't want to slam it on anybody's fingers, but I'd rather slam it on fewer fingers than more fingers. And I feel like if we allow it, we're just going to create more boxes. So that's my concern.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilmember Dugan.
And I had that same concerns, and I think you're right on there, and I agree with that. I also want to say that there is a slight difference between, say, I'm going to say rocks only and AstroTurf, artificial turf. I think there is a difference, and I think there's also a difference probably in you can still get your landscaping probably done by just moving rocks and planting grasses and planting different things compared to, you can't really do that on artificial turf. At least I don't think you could. So I think the project can't just focus only on artificial turf. It has to focus on both of them that were prohibited prior to this new amendment and continues to be prohibited.
Yeah, and maybe I'm like ignorant to this. To me, it seems like the rock situation is easier to convert into something else and come into compliance than I did my whole yard in turf. What do I do now? Like, it seems like that one is on a different scale than some of the other ones, but I might be wrong because there might be a situation I don't know about that is.
We have a new genius at the table, so I'd love for Michaela to add to this.
I mean, I just wanted to pop in and say I do have some concerns about a sunset date, and I'll speak for enforcement a little bit too, right? If we set a like January 1st, 2021, and we see this with all kinds of enforcement, right? Where 11 to 15 to 20 new folks are under enforcement, and then where do we cut the line? Like, hey, I got artificial turf for Christmas. Oh wait, I didn't get a letter. Or we start getting letters in and from whoever is your friend who might be a landscaper, or maybe it's actually true, and then what do we do with that? And then we go to the attorney's office, and then we have to talk to the neighbors about getting photos when they saw it. It's just complicated.
Yeah, and then the neighbor's like, well, I saw my neighbor had it, and so I ordered it. And
yeah,
then...
right, exactly. And just the verification of a date is tough on enforcement.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Councilmember Young?
So I too like a perfect solution. So if we want to add that to the list, I am wondering, and I don't know what the precedence is for this, but I do wonder if instead of it being like a date that you set where you're like, okay, well, anything before then, that we would promote to residents, you have the opportunity to come get your waiver. Like, this is your moment. There's the 6-month window related to anything that has happened before then, but that it is on the household, to be able to say, like, I had installed ahead of time. I would like to come and file and be able to claim like that specific to. I don't know if that exists, but instead of it being upon enforcement, asking for somebody to produce something, if there was a way to basically say, this is your moment to come get certified by the city if you had it ahead of time. Just a thought.
There's a lot of raised eyebrows at the table. Council members, anything else? I really appreciate this team. This feels like something that should be really easy and really direct. And as with all things at the city, it isn't easy or direct. And I appreciate your brilliance and insight helping us navigate this and finding the way to protect us all the best we can. So thank you.
And Madam Chair, I think our plan, just to confirm, would be to get with the administration, various departments, and the attorney's office, maybe come up with some options and then return. Would you like a follow-up work session briefing, or maybe just return to a formal session with a
Council
proposal?
members, how do you feel about this? Do you feel like you need a follow-up to this, or are we ready to bring it to?
I think we need a follow-up just to know what the options are, and then we'll probably want to talk. I just guessing here that we're not all going to coalesce around one option. But yeah, hey, maybe I'm wrong. But I also want to, sorry, one more thing, Madam Chair. So we're still going to move forward with putting the ordinance in place, right? And all the changes. And it's just a question about how we're going to deal with
enforcement. But I think because enforcement is part of the ordinance, from a staff perspective, I don't know that it would go on your formal agenda until we have that piece figured out.
Why? I really want them separated. Is that possible?
From what I understand, not necessarily, because what would go into effect when you adopt the new standards would make the current people enforceable. The current folks who have artificial turf out of compliance. They're already out of compliance.
Both of these discussions are already out of compliance, so they will still be out of compliance no matter what day we do
I think
this.
the understanding was that the compliance was on hold because these changes were working their way through. Once those changes are settled, that kind of ends the reason to withhold to pause compliance.
Oh, yeah, right. We'd have to then, we're no longer pausing compliance because we have a legal document that says yes.
Okay.
I don't want to go another summer without this in place. I don't. So
we'll see you in March. Apparently, we just really like you guys.
Can you come back like tomorrow? Like,
We'll ask the chair for space on the March 5th agenda.
okay, great.
We'll be as efficient, so we won't take up all your life. Okay.
Thank you.
Are there anything else we don't like?
Yeah.
think
Before
everything
we
else-
send them, I like seriously. As much as I like and enjoyed the dialogue, I'd like this to be the last time they have to come to us. Is there anything else you can identify that you would like them to work on and come back to us with?
We added water conservation back in, right? Okay, great. Thank you.
We're at peace. Councilmember Pui?
I mean, as long as the clarity on, this frontage is there, and it's, each frontage is average, meaning that potentially one piece could be segregated if it still complies with the percentage. I'm comfortable with all of that.
Yeah, as long as it's 33% cumulative of a street frontage, you would be able to have a piece that's no vegetation, and that would be okay.
Makes me very happy. Thank you.
Perfect. Anything else? Okay. Well, we look forward to seeing you just one more time on this topic. Thank you. All right, we're going to keep pushing. The next thing is an informational update for developing a priority climate action plan for the Salt Lake City Metropolitan Statistical Area. Ben Ludke, Council Policy Analyst, at the table, joined by Debbie Lyons, Sustainability Director, and Sophia's over there, Sophia Nicholas, Sustainability Deputy Director.
Back in October, as part of Budget Amendment Number 2, the Council approved a $1 million grant from the EPA, which funded a new full-time employee over 4 years, as well as professional consulting services and public engagement. The EPA set a March 1st deadline for the first major deliverable. That is the Priority Climate Action Plan, or PCAP. The next deadline is April 1st. That is when applications are due for measures in the plan that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's only 1 month from submitting the plan to submitting applications. The Inflation Reduction Act is making $4.6 billion available as nationally competitive grant funding. The minimum grant award starts at $2 million or higher. In today's meeting packet, there is a list of 50 priority measures that are draft, so there could be more. Those measures must be in the plan due March 1st to be eligible for the grant applications due April 1st. I'll turn it over to Debbie and Sophia, who have a presentation for you.
Thank you. So the plan that the Priority Climate Action Plan, there we go. The name of the Priority Climate Action Plan that we have come up with is the Greater Salt Lake Area Clean Energy and Air Roadmap, or SL Clear. Next slide, please. And as Ben mentioned, there are 3 key deliverables in the grant. The first one coming up is this priority Priority Climate Action Plan. We call it the PCAP or SL Clear. The Comprehensive Climate Action Plan is a little more future-looking, and where we would look at future policy guidance from the council on this comprehensive climate action plan, and then a status report a few years later. So next slide. So priority is defined by the EPA as, or they've given us guidance that it's near-term, high priority, implementation ready, authority to, and we have authority to implement, or we know what the pathway is to implement something. And so in short, anything that we have in the pipeline that's ready to go within the next 1 to 5 years is what we would include in a priority climate action plan. As I reflect on this path that we've been on, developing this priority climate action plan, it was essentially a comprehensive look at how we would approach applying for any sort of grant. Next slide. So the 4 things that we have to put in the priority climate action plan are a greenhouse gas inventory. We've done this for Salt Lake City. We haven't done it on a regional scale. So this priority climate action plan is for our region. That includes Tooele County and all of Salt Lake County. So we're looking at the greenhouse gas inventory. The priority climate action plan can have a very simple greenhouse gas inventory done. So we are really focusing on energy use and transportation because those are the biggest sectors for greenhouse gas emissions. The next thing is quantified measures. And so those are the ideas that Ben had talked about. We have over 50 of them, and we've gathered those through stakeholder engagement. So there's no shortage of ideas, but quantifying them is another story. That's kind of a big deal and a heavy lift. So some things that are hard to quantify are things like embodied carbon, so like mass timber or something like that. You have to look all the way back on the life cycle to how the trees were grown in the forest. So those are going to be really hard to do in a short amount of time. Some other things like community engagement around a certain action, it's hard to quantify by itself, but it doesn't mean that it's not included in an overall quantification, and would certainly be an activity that you would need to do any sort of community engagement around any activity that we would implement. The next thing is a LIDAC, or Low Income and Disadvantaged Community Benefits Analysis. That's an EPA acronym. And for this, we're using tools from the EPA, climate and economic justice screening tools. And we will also be looking at criteria air pollutants, which is a different quantification methodology than greenhouse gases. We also have the Environmental Justice Resident Committee that's providing feedback on this, and they've met several times to give us feedback. And then we're just evaluating all of our climate risks and vulnerabilities and the impact to the community, whether it's jobs or energy cost or access to services and amenities. Next slide. So back when we were thinking about applying for this grant, we actually had 2 interagency meetings with the jurisdictions where we invited them in, and the EPA hosted the first one, and then we hosted the second one to have a conversation with all of our partners in this about who was going to apply, and all of the jurisdictions really supported Salt Lake City applying. So we went ahead and applied for that grant, and the EPA awarded it in August, and then the council approved it in October. So since October, we've been working on partner agreements, consulting RFPs, we're hiring staff. We've had 8 jurisdictional meetings, including 2 with our own internal department staff to get feedback. I talked about our Resident Environmental Justice Committee. It was established with partnership with the University Neighborhood Partners. We did a public survey, and now we're coalescing around what the implementation grant will be, and then hopefully submit the PCAP to the EPA on March 1st. One thing I'll note is the state is leading a similar process. They are focused more broadly on state agencies and areas outside of our area that we're focused on, but they have been involved in our stakeholder process, and we've been involved in theirs, so we're collaborating very closely with the state on their pathway as well. So next slide. As Ben mentioned, we have more than 57 total separate concepts that were shared with us, and we categorize them into different priority sectors. So in the building sector, for example, we got 25 ideas submitted. In electricity, we got 14. In transportation, we got 28. We received a few ideas in the waste and sustainable materials category, natural lands, wastewater, and a couple of workforce development suggestions. Our department, Sustainability Department, has been really focused on the Utah Renewable Communities and fleet electrification, where we have gotten support to pursue those two activities through our budget and elsewhere. So separately, we're working with transportation on potential inclusion of green bike, and we're working with urban forestry on whether we could include a tree project, and public utilities. We're talking to them about their biodigester. So we're still working on those ideas for the grant, and all of the details, I think, are in that PDF that was shared with you. So next slide. So from here, we're happy to get your feedback today in this meeting, or because we're on such a tight timeline, we're happy to work with council staff to get your feedback within the next week or so. We're still quantifying and crunching numbers and developing that narrative for that final PCAP. And we'll submit that by March 1st. And then we're working on those implementation grants I mentioned. And then we'll come back after the budget season and talk more details about the comprehensive climate action plan that has a little bit longer legroom to get more of your feedback and that future-looking policy guidance from you. So that's, I would open it up for questions.
Thank you. Councilmember Dugan.
I know this, thank you very much, because I know this, Christopher's been working hard on this grant because it really impacts the Utah renewable communities, we're leading that way in that regard. Could you kind of expand on that and why it's so important for that group to submit for this grant and also to receive this grant, how that would impact that community?
Yeah. Sophia, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's fortuitous timing, as you know, but we are looking at ways that we can work with Rocky Mountain Power and our other the other agencies that are part of that coalition to minimize or reduce the cost of those initial renewable energy developments that would come online through the URC program, the Utah Renewable Communities Program. So I think it's going to be a very innovative application. We haven't heard that anything in our URC is not allowed, and I think it has the potential to really transform a lot of our energy sector, which is the goal of this grant. So does that give you enough? Christopher's been in the weeds on it, but yeah.
Expand that on just for the council. So part of this grant would allow us to have a financial backstop on procuring clean renewable resources that we were struggling with, and how we were to pay for that. This would give us that backstop if we were to receive this grant. We could have that backstop. It's basically the insurance to cover the resources if the program was to fail and Rocky Mountain Power would end up with this resource. They'd have a backstop so that they wouldn't end up losing money in this case. And so it's a really a huge lift for the renewable community if we were to receive that grant. So thank you very much. I do have one question about the March 1st, because we don't have a meeting between now and March 5th. So what do you need from us? Oh, I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Sorry, an important bill just dropped. Yes, Councilmember Young.
So I'm going to build on that question. So as I look at the PCAP is basically our request for all the items, or just for those within the first 1 to 5 years that are quick action?
The PCAP is supposed to embody all of the priorities of all the jurisdictions that are part of this. So there are multiple jurisdictions. And in order for those ideas to qualify for those implementation grants, they have to be captured in the PCAP and quantified somehow. So what goes into the PCAP is reflective of all the jurisdictions. We just had our eye on Utah Renewable Communities and fleet electrification infrastructure.
Got it. So those are the kind of the Salt Lake City components, but then there's the greater plan.
Yeah.
For those specific pieces that are Salt Lake, do we have to identify what the cost is, or are we just asking if these like activities qualify?
For the PCAP, we just need to identify what qualifies. And then for the implementation grants, we will be applying for specific dollars. So we'll have to have some idea of the cost.
Okay, that's helpful. Because it sounds to me that anything, to your point, that you've identified from a city perspective where we're already investing in a lot of these efforts and activities that would ultimately benefit, the air and the other environmental aspects, to make sure they're in the PCAP so that they have an opportunity in the future to be able to qualify, makes sense to me. So I don't have any other feedback related to the proposal. I appreciate the time and effort to, it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts, but would support you moving forward with those particular aspects in PCAP.
Thank you.
Thank you. And council members, anything else?
Back to the question, do you need a straw poll? Do you need us to, what do we need to?
No, if you have any other feedback as you look through the ideas and you're like, where is this? Feel free to reach out to your staff and we'll keep in touch with Ben on any ideas or any feedback that you might have.
Okay, so you don't need our approval to submit the thing by the 1st. You're already doing that?
No,
Okay.
no, it's a grant deliverable for the grant that was already approved. Yep.
That was my question. Okay, great, thanks.
I would like to, sorry, clearly something happened. I would like to ask procedural questions. Clearly, the work done is exceptional. Clearly, the concept, the attracting of resources, all wonderful. I would like us to be considered a constituency group and stakeholder group much earlier in the process, especially because now not only do we have an incredibly protracted time to get you feedback, but it's in the last 10 days of the most intense legislative session we've ever lived through. So we need to be more prioritized as the legislative body to get to you earlier. I don't know what that looks like with us helping you, if the next time we approve the grant, if we remind you or what, so tell us where the process we can help with that, but we need to be involved in the process much sooner, because I'm already telling that I'm not going to be able to give this the attention it's due before the deadline, and I really hate that, especially since our districts are the ones that are put in the EPA environmental justice area, and we potentially need this resource the most. I hate that I'm not going to be able to. So if you want to collaborate on what that looks like, I'm happy to.
Thank you. We do have, so the April 1st is the deadline for that grant application, and we'll go through the regular grant process that we normally do, but we do have some time until April 1st to entertain ideas for that.
I'd really love to do small groups or something when we can all focus and dig deeper on this. This is worth a lot more attention than what we're all able to give it in the next couple days. But thank you. Council people, anything else? Okay. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for being early and tolerating our schedule shifting. Council, we need to take a break now because the next group is unable to flex. So let's go ahead and plan. We are literally running 50 minutes ahead of schedule. Let's go ahead and take a good 20 and breathe and cry or do whatever it is we need to do. All right. We are still running ahead of schedule, but we have everyone in place that we need to for the next item. We are now going to get an informational update on the financial risks and reserve analysis. We've got Mary Beth Thompson joining us at the table, as well as Shane Kavanaugh, the Senior Research Manager at GFOA. All right, the floor is yours.
We also have Andrew Johnston here. I mean, not Andrew Johnston, Andrew Reed. It's because we were talking about him. Yes. Andrew Reed. Andrew was worked closely with Shane. Actually, he got all the data for Shane to put together this risk assessment. Let me give you a little bit of background before we have Shane start. Council gave us $75,000 to do a risk assessment back in, I think, 2018. Then we had the pandemic and we had all of the stuff. Well, the risk assessment has been completed. And so we brought Shane in to talk to you all about the risk assessment, reserves, and fund balance.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. It is my pleasure to be meeting with you here today. So we have some slides that we'll be putting up on screen to walk you through that. And I guess while those slides are getting put on screen, just a little bit of background for those who are not familiar with the organization I work for. That is the Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA, and we've been around since 1906. We are the professional association of local government and state government CFOs and other finance professionals throughout the country. And our job is to help local governments with making the best of their financial situation and decisions. And one of the perennial questions that comes up in local government is the question of reserves and how much should be maintained in reserves. So that is the subject, as Mary Beth described, of the work we did together. So I'm going to walk through these slides. And why don't we go to the next one here, which was going to talk a bit about what our goals for today are. So we've got 5 goals. Number 1, we're going to define reserves, because that term can be a little we'll call it open to interpretations. I'm going to interpret that one for you. Define the risks that Salt Lake City is subject to. So you'll see that this is a risk-based reserve of analysis. We're going to define what those risks are. We're going to talk about what the exposure to those risks are. We'll also put those findings together and go to next steps after that. And the big picture goal here is to gain awareness of how the analysis was performed, what the results are, and what implications there are going forward. So if we'd be so kind as to move to the next slide. What we see here on the next slide is our step 1, define reserves. Before I go further, I'm going to mention if anyone has questions at any time, feel free to jump in. I'll also be doing pauses every so often to check in, but I would also just welcome anyone to interrupt whenever they would like if any questions come up. So why don't we jump into step 1, so moving to the next question here. So I like to start with this slide, and the idea here is that public finance can be a complicated topic, right? And anything that's complicated in life, we use mental models to simplify that topic and gain an understanding of it. And if we go to the next slide here, what I'd like to do is begin by defining reserves and kind of tie that to this idea of mental model. So when we talk about a reserve, what we are talking about is the resources available outside of the budget if the resources appropriated inside the budget are insufficient, and this offers protections against unplanned, unavoidable costs or losses. In other words, these are things held in reserve, right, not appropriated, that can be brought into the resources that can be used should the existing appropriated resources prove insufficient. So if we move forward to the next slide, we'll see that the traditional mental model for reserves have been the savings account. Maybe some of you have even heard this idea that the reserves are the savings account for the city. And this is a good mental model in many ways, right? It's easy to grasp and has a seemingly obvious parallel to our personal lives. But on the next slide, I would suggest to you that this mental model has some limitations. Number 1 is that savings are just commonly viewed in our personal life as more as a method of deferred spending than as a way to manage risk. And it also implies that more is better, but when it comes to reserves, it is I think there are upper limits, right, to the amount of reserves one would want to maintain. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to present to you my alternative. I would suggest that maybe a different mental model we might think about is an insurance policy, right? So if reserves manage volatility and risk is a product of volatility, reserves then help us manage risk, and it has a few advantages that I think are fairly important. Also, a parallel to our personal lives, it invites us to think about the interaction with commercial insurance, and it also implies there's an optimal amount, right? Because I think we can all appreciate you can over-insure various risks, right? And it's the same thing when it comes to reserves. So why don't we move on to the next slide? And I want to make the point here is that I'm not saying savings account is a bad mental model. I'm just saying that I think putting them together, reserves as insurance plus reserves as a savings account, leads to the savviest possible financial strategy, because reserves helps you put a lens on things to think about the risks you're subject to, whereas reserves as a savings account provides a lens that encourages savvy multi-year thinking about what investments you might want to make in the future for costs that maybe don't fit within a single year's budget. So if we could go ahead and advance the slide, we're now going to get into part 2, but before I do that, just want a quick check-in to see if there are any questions or comments we'd like to bring up at this point. If not, happy to keep going.
Council? All right, looks like you have the green light.
Excellent, thanks so much. All right, why don't we move in then to step 2 to define the risks that we're insuring against. So I want to go ahead and first draw a distinction between a shock and a stress. So what I've got on the slide here is the idea as a shock is something there was a rapid decline in financial position followed by some kind of recovery period. So if you think of like a natural catastrophe, right, that is often going to be the case, right, where say a flood or a fire or something like this, there are certainly going to be some significant and immaterial damages, but there's going to be a recovery period after that. Now I'm going to contrast this with a stress, right? So an example of a stress might be unemployment or maybe a decline in a major industry where there's a steady downward pressure and is an ongoing, maybe even semi-permanent situation. And the reason I'm drawing this distinction is that reserves are not a great answer for a stress, because a reserve is a non-renewable resource. You use it once and it's gone, whereas a stress is an ongoing thing. So when we move to the next slide, you will see that the risks I've showed here all tend to be shocks, right? So we're not dealing so much with the stresses, we're dealing with the shocks. And so these are some examples of the types of natural and human-made catastrophes that were included in our risk model. I'll be talking a bit more about the risk model shortly, but we looked at wildfires, earthquakes, tornadoes, strong winds, floods, and then other hazards. So when I say other hazards, we worked with the folks in the emergency management function of Salt Lake City to examine the emergency management plan and take stock of all the different types of risks that they found in their work, and then we integrated those into our model. Why don't we move on there? So there's also another important type of shock, and that's recessions. So we also took a look at recessions as a risk, and what I've got on the little screen here is sales tax is by far the most important revenue for the Salt Lake City General Fund, and sales tax has a reputation across the country, and that reputation is lived up to here in Salt Lake City as being a revenue that is more vulnerable to economic recessions than, say, the property taxes or some other types of revenue. So given that dependence on the sales tax is very important to take account of the potential for a recession to cause losses in revenue. And I also will just briefly mention pensions. The idea here is that if we do have poor economic performance, there is a very good chance that the Utah retirement system will have we'll call it suboptimal returns on its investments, and poor returns on the investments could translate into additional required pension contributions for Salt Lake City. In fact, this has happened in the past, so it is certainly plausible that it could happen in the future, and all that was also included in the model. So why don't we move on to our next slide, which is step 3. Now again, I'm going to take another pause to see if there are any questions, comments, or anything folks would like to get into before we move on to part 3.
Council? Is it possible that growth is considered a stress? So for instance, we have lots of amazing opportunities which are requiring our tax increment to be committed for a generation. This to me feels like ridiculous stress as I think about the level of service increase that it'll require without a predictable revenue stream attached to it. Can growth be considered a stress?
Absolutely. So we actually do look at that as part of our analyses, where the idea being, especially, right, if you have, this is not so much in Salt Lake's case, but the classic example is you're very property tax dependent. Growth happens. It takes a few years for that to actually hit your books. You have to service that development while waiting for the property tax. That would be a nice advantage of having more sales taxes, that you tend to see the revenue more quickly from developments. But yes, 100% very rapid growth could be a stress for sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Good to go. All right, let's proceed with step 3. So if we could move on to the next slide, that would be great. So the big question is, how did we analyze these risks? So we use something called Monte Carlo simulation. And this is technology that's been around since the 1950s. So it's not new. What is new is that we no longer need supercomputers that fill up whole rooms in order to perform it. I can do it on my laptop and email the results to Andrew, and he can work on it in his laptop, all in Excel, so we no longer need proprietary software either. So the models I send to Andrew have no proprietary anything in them other than Microsoft technology, so very transferable. This is a standard practice in industries like insurance that deal with risk, so we're using the exact same methods that insurance companies use to do this. And if you've never heard of it, a way to think about Monte Carlo is essentially a multiverse, right? So if you're familiar with like science fiction movies, this like the recent trope has been multiverses, and the idea being there's all these different parallel universes and different things could happen in each one of these parallel universes. So that is essentially what we did, is we created 10,000 parallel universes of Salt Lake City. And each parallel universe, you have different combinations of these risks that might befall Salt Lake City. So in, say, parallel universe 315, maybe there's a really bad recession, a minor flood, and no earthquake. But in, let's say, parallel universe 712, there is a big earthquake, no recession, and a small wildfire, something like this, right? So the point being, I'm oversimplifying there, but the point being is that there are these combinations of uncertainty that are generated by the computer simulation. So the next question you might be is, well, how are you determining, when and where these things occur, which brings us to the next slide. So this is the data that we use to build the simulation. Is number one, the city's own historical experience. So I'll give you an example. We looked at the city's revenue declines during the Great Recession and the 2001 dot-bomb recession. And we use those as the guidelines for what might happen in a future recession, because 2008 was the worst recession since World War II. 2001 was one of the mildest, so those were the guidelines for what future recessions could look like. And I will kind of point out that when I say guidelines, I don't mean floor and ceiling. The simulation will occasionally produce recessions that are worse than 2008 and occasionally ones that are less than 2001. And when I say occasionally, I mean statistically derived likelihood. So we looked at, and I'll just give you very precise numbers here. The 2008 recession was what's called the 90th percentile, which means 90% of the time things were not as bad. So in our parallel universes, only 10% of the parallel universes where there are recessions will have recessions worse than 2008. So I'll give you another example on the slide here is historical experience in the wider region. So the example here would be tornadoes. So there's only been a handful of tornadoes that have touched Salt Lake City in recent memory, but there have been a lot more in the wider county, right? And one could ask, was it just luck that they didn't touch Salt Lake City proper and they were just in the county? So we looked at the history of tornadoes in the wider region, and then the model simulated, well, what if Salt Lake City were not as lucky in the future, right? And some of those tornadoes did impact Salt Lake City proper. And what if Salt Lake City was luckier and few of those tornadoes might have impacted Salt Lake City? So we use the regional history to inform what the model might look like. We also work closely with the city's finance staff, as Mary Beth mentioned, as well as the public safety staff to bring into information that the emergency management folks have gathered. For example, I have in the little bullet there, calibrated estimators. The finance staff went through a training to improve their ability to work with probabilities. So we use that training in their new skills to help us tune some parts of the model. And then we use third-party experts. So the first bullet there is Ann and First Street are two national and, well, Ann is global and First Street is national purveyors of risk information. Ann, if you've never heard of them, is a really big insurance company. So we would get their simulations of earthquakes in Utah and build their simulations into our model. So I mentioned we're using the exact same techniques the insurance companies are using. We basically download the exact results from Ann's systems and put them into our model for earthquakes. We talked with state earthquake experts to make sure we're taking into account local characteristics, and also county flood experts on floods, for example. So all that information was used to help us estimate the likelihood and severity of these different catastrophes that are in the model. So if we could move on to the next slide, that'd be great. So what we kind of did with all this, or what the results were, was that these simulations produce what are known as distributions of different outcomes. And if you're not familiar with this concept of a distribution, I'm just going to illustrate it really quickly. Some of you may have heard of a normal distribution or a bell curve, and if you're not familiar with it, the height of American men are normally distributed, and what that means is the average American male is 5'9", so they're at the highest point on this curve. That is the most frequently occurring height. Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones is 4'5". There are not as many people as tall as him, so he's on a lower point on the curve. And Shaq, pretty tall guy, not as many people as tall as Shaq, so that is also at a low point on the curve. Now, if we translate this on the next slide over to something that would be a little bit more salient to local government, we might think about snow. So when it comes to snow, you've got at the top an average snow season. Over to the left, you could have some seasons with very little snow. And then over on the right, you've got sometimes snowpocalypse, right? So there could be quite a bit. If you go to the next slide, we'll see how this is relevant. And I pulled this little example from a county in Canada we worked with because I think it's quite striking. Snow, really big deal up in the northern parts of Canada. So in their case, they had their budget set for snow removal where that little green box is on the curve. And so what that means is everything to the right of that green box is stuff not covered by their budget, or potential snowfall costs not covered by their budget. There's a lot of space under that curve to the right of the green box, right? It's a lot there. And so the question then is like, well, how are you going to cover that? And I'm not suggesting you need to increase your budget. It just might be, while your reserve might need to be sized, where if you have a really bad snow season, you're good to go. That portion under the curve is accounted for. Now, I want to move to the next slide and show you this here. I think this is interesting because this is more relevant to Salt Lake City's case. I'm going to give you some Salt Lake City graphs very shortly. They're coming right out of the simulation. But in Salt Lake City's case, a lot of things we're dealing with are this hockey stick-shaped loss curve, like that was that bell-shaped thing that we just looked at. This is hockey stick-shaped, and why this is important is the average earthquake, right, is over to the left on my graph, which is like somewhere close to a tremor. And like, yeah, we're not so much worried about tremors, right? We're worried about the big one, and in the case of Salt Lake City, 7.0 is, in some reports by earthquake experts, a bit of a threshold point where there's vulnerability of unreinforced masonry buildings, things like this. So we're really concerned about these long tails, and our simulation is taking into account also these kind of hockey stick shaped loss curves. Is a big part of the work we're doing, is to really take that into account and think about where reserves play into those particular types of losses. So why don't we go to the next slide, because we're getting close here to showing the results from the Salt Lake City analysis specifically. So before I do that, I'm going to take another pause here and check in to see if there's anything that anyone would want to bring up before we get to step 4.
Council, everyone good? All right.
All right, moving forward. All right, if we can move to the next slide then. There we go. All right, so before we're going to start getting into the risks that we analyze, so first, some important points is, number one, risks do not add up like you might expect. And what I'm getting at here is, imagine we did a simulation where we said, well, we want to be 90% confident that we have enough money set aside to cover a bad earthquake. And we want to be 90% confident we have enough money set aside for a bad flood, and 90% confident we have money set aside for a wildfire, say. And then we added all those things together, right? That sounds like it might be reasonable on the face of it, but what that doesn't take into account is you are highly unlikely to experience all three of those things at the same time. So if you just added them all up, you would end up over-insuring yourself, essentially, right? So our models take that into account. So I want to just make that clear. Also, the models take into account a bunch of other mitigating factors, with probably maybe the leading example being that Salt Lake City is not going to just sit back and do nothing if, let's say, a big recession happens. In the past, you all have cut spending, for example, in response to such a thing. So the model takes that into account. In fact, our model has an assumed willingness to cut the budget by 3%. Any and all assumptions in our model are user definable, so Andrew can very easily change those to any other value. If you wish to explore those other values, that can be done. And then lastly here is we have this idea of a critical threshold in the model, and you can think of this kind of as your reserves as a gas tank, and the critical threshold is where we're starting to reach E on that gas tank, right? And I want to point out that you all have a very, I think, distinct advantage compared to some of the other folks that we've worked with, where you have these robust positions and other funds, right? Because we have to think about the city as an entire system, in addition to thinking about it as funds. And from an entire system standpoint, Salt Lake City is in pretty darn good shape in many ways. So why don't we move on to the next slide here. So I'm going to talk a little bit bond rating agency expectations, because those are, was there a question?
I should have asked earlier, but just occurred to me.
Oh, yeah.
So it sounds like the risks that we're going to be talking about that you assessed were largely natural occurring. We didn't assess any risks, like things like an active shooter or a biomedical attack or the other things that we prepared for.
Actually, yes. So
You did,
those were under the other risks. So that was in the public
perfect. Thank
safety
you.
plan. So they went through all that stuff, and we what we did is, I'll take a little aside here. I think we're doing pretty good on the time. If to go into a little detail on this is so there's a whole bunch of risks called, like, what I'll call unknown unknowns, right? Where they've never happened before in Salt Lake City history. How do we deal with these things, right? So we looked back at your entire history and said, what's every weird thing that's ever happened to Salt Lake City? Because they happen.
We have so many.
So many weird things. Like there was a pandemic you may have heard recently. That was big.
We had a windstorm in India.
Yeah, right. There was a Chevron oil spill a number of years back that cost a fair bit of money. So stuff like this. So we looked back through all this and said, well, what had been the range of costs? We used the public safety plan where they listed out all these different risks, and then the model basically takes all those risks that the public safety folks listed out. They estimated the likelihood of all those different risks. So the model goes through and simulates each of the risks that the public safety folks identified, along with using their likelihoods and the historical costs the city has incurred from some of these, we'll call it like strange losses, to help us, put some boundaries on what the cost might be. So
Thank you.
all that is accounted for. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. Bond rating agency expectations. So talk a little bit about, was there another?
He was worried that we lost our quorum for a second. Sorry, this is during legislative session, and it's the last 10 days, and so...
I see.
Yeah.
All good.
Yeah. But those of us who are here, especially, this is why I love working with Councilmember Young. She's the only one who geeks out on this stuff with me the way I do.
All right, excellent. Good. All right, so bond rating expectations. So we'll see how this plays in a minute, but a little background here. So SLC has a goal of maintaining AAA bond rating. One of the bond rating agencies is Moody's, and Moody's is a good place to work with because, well, just use for this type of analysis, I should say, because they publish all their standards in fairly explicit quantitative terms, so you can build this into a model fairly easily. And Moody's identifies a fund balance equal to about 35% of revenues across the entire government as equal to AAA. And this is interesting, right? Where they're looking across the entire government. It's not 35% in your general fund or 35% in this fund. It's 35% across the entire government, right? And because you have these robust balances in the other funds, right, that means it's a little easier for the general fund to help meet the goal because you've got these balances in the other funds that are help pushing Salt Lake City over this 35% line, right? So less work, so to speak, the general fund has to do. Now, the kind of nuance here is that our analysis is based on reserves, right, which is a bit of a different concept. This is your self-insurance. We're not necessarily as concerned with the entire general fund balance. In other words, we're looking at the insurance policy aspect of things. And if we go to the next slide, I hope this will help illuminate this point a bit more. So what we see here is the total general fund unrestricted fund balance is $144 million approximately. And if we look at the insurance policy aspect of it, that's about $54 million, which leaves about $90 million as the savings account. So you have both the savings account and the insurance policy here represented. The rating agencies care about that whole thing because they care about your ability to pay back debt. That is why they're interested in this, right? We have I would say, argue a broader focus, right? We are concerned about SLC's ability to quickly and responsibly react to losses and natural catastrophes and other sorts of things, right? More than just payback bonds. So we have to take into account that I would call more important and more maybe broader type of consideration. So if we move to the next slide, we'll say a bit more about that. So some of the implications of this is that if we reduce either the savings account or the insurance policy, it would make it somewhat harder, right, to meet the rating agency's expectations. This is not an argument to say, I would be very clear, I'm not saying it would make it hard to meet the rating agency's expectations. It would just make it harder, right, or it would just make it somewhat less easy depending on how you look at it, because if there's just fewer dollars in either the savings account or the insurance policy, you're going to be less, further, I guess, closer to the rating agency. You're above 35% right now, have less in either your savings account or your insurance policy. You're bringing yourself closer down to the 35% threshold. Now, in theory, you can borrow from enterprise funds or internal service funds in emergency, not a first option, but theoretically possible. And this is where the bond rating agencies, again, they're worried about your ability to repay debt. SLC has broader concerns, such as just making sure the general fund is able to backstop those funds that don't have robust reserves and otherwise make sure that general operations are able to continue to be responded or continue to be provided despite interruptions from recessions, natural catastrophes, or other sorts of losses that our analysis considered. So why don't we move on to the next slide? We're going to start getting into some of the more details of your analysis. So a few other factors that we looked at that were part of the model is FEMA and other reimbursements. So FEMA will reimburse you for natural catastrophes should they happen. So this is part of the model. The kind of key takeaway here is this does not reduce the need to hold reserves because it takes about 2 years to get the money from FEMA. So this is, it will help you replenish it faster, but you still need to respond in the meantime. Commercial insurance is included in the model, so we do have considerations for that. Tax-based impairment, so the idea here is a large 7.0 earthquake could damage many buildings, and if they're damaged to the point where they're unoccupiable, they cannot produce sales tax, not produce property tax. That is part of the model, and I'll show you that when we show the results from your model. And then we talked about the unknown, so we had a good conversation about that, so I feel we've covered that. And then the opportunity cost is the last one I'll focus in on this slide because I think we've touched upon the others. And the idea here is we just have to acknowledge that there are choices and trade-offs to be made, and opportunity cost is simply the cost foregone by keeping money in reserve or in a fund balance, right? Is money not being spent on other things? And, one can weigh what's the benefit we get from self-insuring against these risks to the degree we're self-insuring them versus what are the benefit we might get from using those funds and other stuff is what that boils down to. So why don't we move on to the next slide? And what we're going to see here is our first result from the model that I'm showing you. And so the good news is here is it shows that the city has a relatively small chance, less than 5% chance, in fact, of running into the critical threshold over the 10-year analysis period that we have. And again, this is a contributor to this. One of the contributors to this is that the strong or robust positions of SLC and its various funds makes it easier to meet the rating agency's expectation. Our critical threshold is based on rating agency expectations. So we're defining the critical threshold as the ability to meet that 35% goal that the rating agencies have. So we'll move on to the next slide. I'll show you another perspective on the same idea. So this one is showing the 10-year analysis period again, and it's showing your average reserve. So across our 10,000 parallel universes, what is the reserve on average? And that blue line is it's flat. So in other words, that's good, right? The reserve is not declining. That's a positive thing. Now I will point out there, our little blue box that has the assumptions. The annual surpluses are used to build back the reserve, so the model does simulate annual surpluses and deficits in non-recession years. So throughout SLC's history, you are more likely to have a surplus than you are a deficit. And so that means if you have a surplus and you're below, your reserves are running low, you have the opportunity to build them back up using that surplus. And so the model takes that into account. And then we already talked about this briefly earlier, is that it also has the assumption that the SLC is willing to cut its budget up to 3% in response to recessions. And what that's getting at is if the losses are more than 3%, then the reserve absorbs it. But if it's less than 3%, then the budget cuts absorb it, right? So but that is a buffer, right? So that does help the reserves stay equal. If you change those assumptions, the result of this graph would change. And again, Andrew has the model, so is able to do that. So why don't we move on to the next slide? And the last one I want to point out here is this is a little different presentation that shows in 10 years how confident can the city be that the existing general reserve fund or general fund reserve will be enough. And the little black dotted line is our current reserve, and what it's showing is it's intersecting the red line at a pretty high number, well above 90%, which is very consistent with that bar graph I showed you that showed that was a very small chance to reach the critical threshold over that 10-year period. This is just looking at it from the other side, right? To saying, you know what, a high chance that your existing reserve will be enough. But I really want to point out here what's interesting on this slide is the really long red line that goes out quite far to the right. And what that's showing is you get something like a 7.0 earthquake or higher, which is not a super common occurrence, but if it did happen, that could be quite bad. And the losses could be quite high, especially when you factor in tax-based impairment. So this is recognizing that that is a risk. And I think where it raises the possibilities, it might ask, well, is reserves the right tool for that job? And in the report, we describe some recommendations for other tools that might be better fit for the job for that really long tail other than reserves. So that just kind of highlights that element of the report. So why don't I move on to the next slide, or if our able-bodied person could move it on, that'd be great. So before we go to step 5, if there's any comments, questions, or other anything else people would like to get into.
Looks like I just wanted to understand quickly, you said it looked like in that projection we would not reach that critical threshold. There was a slim chance, is that correct?
Yes, unlikely to reach the critical threshold. So if we could maybe skip back a few slides, I'll show that one slide. I think it's maybe like, keep going one more, please. I think this one is maybe the one that we're referring to. This is the chance to reach the critical threshold, and those chances are pretty low, right? So we're saying below 5% across those 10 years. And I'll point this out, is the line, like the bars get bigger the further you go into the future, and that happens in virtually every one we ever work with. And the idea is because just more bad things can happen the further you look out, right? Like, what's the chance you're gonna have an earthquake next year? What's the chance you'll have an earthquake at some point within the next 10, right? It's gonna be higher, you'll have it at some point within the next 10, if that makes sense.
And does this only account for natural disasters or all types of extreme disasters?
So this is all those natural catastrophes on that one slide, the recessions, the pensions, and all those man-made sorts of things we were talking about in the emergency management plan. So it includes all those shocks.
Thank you. That was just, it made me think of Trolley Square, and over the past decade, it has not recovered, actually. And I'd love to, I don't know if we're able to get that granular, but I know in our city we have experienced this. So thank you for articulating that.
All right, great question.
I think you have a green light from everyone else.
All right, cool. So if we could move on to the next slide after that one, that would be great. So, so the starting points for moving on from here. So number one is that GFOA cannot tell you the exact amount of reserves you could hold, and why is that? Is because the policy must incorporate your risk attitude and risk appetite as elected officials. And so the little example I like to give is, imagine I am an avid sports gambler and cryptocurrency speculator, which I'm not, but imagine it. And imagine you have never bought so much as a lottery ticket in your life. Now, imagine what my definition of low risk would be versus your definition of low risk, right? Very different. So you would not want to substitute my risk appetite for your risk appetite in that case. So risk appetite is part of the game, and all the data that we provide can certainly 100% point you in some directions that are going to be better than others, but at the end of the day, you all have to decide, what is our risk attitude and risk appetite? What are we willing to take on? What are the opportunity costs we're willing to incur, right, for holding reserves and fund balance? And the kind of next point here is, regardless of whatever kind of number is settled upon, we would strongly recommend a range of reserves rather than the single number. And I'll give you an example on the next slide here. And why don't we just go to the next slide and I'll talk about those bullets. This is from the city of Tempe, Arizona. And back in 2009, they had a single number as their reserve target, where they're going to have reserves equal to 25% of their expenditures as the goal. And they would have a lot of non-value-added arguments over their current reserve at the time was 32%. Well, is this good? Meaning 32 is higher than 25. Is that a good thing? Maybe. And so the kind of argument, the solution was, well, why don't we agree on a range? And that range is, we want to keep our reserves between 20 and 30. And over time, we're going to bring our reserves into this range. And now all we have to do is worry about whether or not this black line is within the golden cone. And if it's in the golden cone, we're good to go, right? You can stop talking about this and move on to other things. If it's below the golden cone, that gives us a very good clue, right, that we should probably do things to build the reserve up. And if it's above the golden cone, that suggests to us that perhaps we are incurring excess opportunity costs, right? We may want to spend those reserves on other things. So I think having a range is quite valuable for that reason. Plus, it accommodates different risk appetites. I'm guessing folks on the council here probably have some different risk appetites. I've been in meetings where there's some very different risk appetites. And so this accommodates different risk appetites. Folks that are maybe a little more risk averse might prefer something higher. Those maybe less risk averse might prefer something lower. Having a range can accommodate both those views. So I believe we might have one more slide here, so why don't we move on to that? Be so kind. So some of the next steps here is, so I know there's a lot of information to take in, so it's just taking some time to consider your risk appetites in light of the information presented. The council and administration can then determine the preferred amount of reserve based on risk appetite, based on the data presented here. Again, Andrew has the model, and also, of course, we're on hand to help out with additional support as might be needed to use this information. And then lastly is the SLC Council and Administration can consider a comprehensive reserve policy. The idea being here is GFOA is a big fan of having a formal policy that documents the target range of reserves that you will maintain, as well as the agreed upon rules for the situations in which reserves will be used and the acceptable purposes of using the reserves, and also some intent for how to replenish those reserves. So I believe that is the end of my remarks, and I would love to have further discussion or comments, questions.
Councilmember Young?
So I appreciate this. It definitely builds on a conversation that we had in a previous council meeting where we were looking at the reserves. It's interesting to do kind of a compare contrast between those two conversations, because in the first conversation, I think we were looking at our fund balances in regards to not wanting to be an entity that overtaxes, obviously, especially when there's economic pressures on the individual households. Looking at it through your lens today of risk, it's like, no, actually, it would be better if we had more savings, in terms of what that looks like. And so your last slide in terms of that golden cone of prosperity, I think resonates with me in terms of you're trying to find a middle line. Like, you don't want to be in either of those extremes. You really want to find that centerpiece. I think the other piece about next steps that resonates with me is considering what that type of a reserve policy is in our great state of Utah, we have what is called the Rainy Day Fund that exists related to some of the state actions. There's not always clear guidelines of what constitutes a rainy day, such as a pandemic, which did not. So kind of considering what those aspects are is definitely something that I would be interested in as we move forward with looking at the current general fund balance. Do we want to pursue opportunities to be able to mitigate risk through some sort of reserve policy, and then having pieces around that? So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Anyone else? I want us as a group to reference one of the early slides, that this reserve is not the same thing as fund balance. It is something separate from that. And I think I would really value Mary Beth's guidance and council staff's guidance on what next steps are. I would like to make this a priority this year for us to put a policy in place and to move toward this. We're living on borrowed time right now. So I'd like to take this seriously and really thank you for your insights. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Council, I was really excited to see Shane here in Utah and totally skipped over our budget number 4 amendment. So, Shane, you can go and relax now, but I'm going to keep Mary Beth, ask Greg to come join us, and Lisa and Ben Ludke, if you would like to come up. Yeah, I was real excited. Like, risk really does it for me, man.
Madam Chair, for next steps, council staff is taking your conversation from the council retreat where you talked about fund balance, as well as your comments today, and we're consolidating that into several council preferences, and we'll be sharing that with you as a next step to communicate it to the administration for BA5 and consideration in the next annual budget.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Budget amendment number 4. The public hearing is scheduled for tonight. If you want a reminder on the 4 straw polls that you took at the last briefing, those are listed on the first and second page of the staff report. I'll pick up where we left off on item A2. It's a request for $49,000 from general fund balance for short-term rental identification software. This is split into 2 parts. It's $39,000 for the software and $10,000 for training. This would help the Civil Enforcement Division monitor and enforce violations for short-term rentals that are not in compliance with city code. This would include ADUs, accessory dwelling units. The inspectors would be able to identify the properties more quickly and easily. And a reminder, the council added 2 civil enforcement inspectors in the last annual budget, so the team is bigger.
The civil enforcement professionals, that's not the RV one, that's just general civil enforcement?
Correct.
Okay.
The RV is in compliance.
Thank you.
Not
Okay.
civil enforcement in the Community and Neighborhoods Department.
Thank you. Council, questions, concerns? Do we have any straw polls for today, or are we just strictly going through things?
Nope, you've already gone over the urgent items at the previous meeting.
Sometimes they pop up on me. All right, go ahead, Ben, we're following you.
Next is A4. This is Liberty Park greenhouses stabilization and entrance gates. There are 3 separate appropriations in this item. 2 of them are related to the greenhouses in the center of Liberty Park. There was a recently completed facility condition assessment. It found that all of the greenhouses in the buildings are severely deteriorated and damaged. As a result, they are closed. They are not currently being used for operations. The oldest of the buildings is believed to have been constructed in 1902, and then several additions were added to it over the decades. There's a $2 million Okay. I'll do that next. There's a $2 million estimate on the high end for all of the damage and the deterioration at those multiple buildings. To fix everything in the assessment, it was estimated to be $2 million. That is not the request today. The request today is $31,000 from fund balance for ongoing greenhouse operations. This could include temporary operations. It's only partial year funding. The next annual budget would need $62,000 ongoing for greenhouse operations. The larger appropriation for the greenhouses is for urgent repairs. That's $248,000. And this would be a reappropriation using vacancy savings in the Public Lands Department. The full cost for those $2 million of repairs, that could come to the council in a CIP request in future years. The third appropriation is $37,000, also using vacancy savings for adding gates to control after-hours vehicle access at Liberty Park. So these would be posted on the north and the south entrances off of 9th South and 13th South, and then they would be posted on the east and west sides of the interior loop that vehicles use to drive around the park. And the Historic Landmark Commission would be involved since it's a historic park.
Councilmember Young.
So, Ben, I just have a question related to a future CIP application. Do we know if I know there was last year, a CIP application related to this. Do we expect one this year?
That was a constituent application, and it was combining greenhouses at Jordan Park with these greenhouses at Liberty Park. My understanding is those constituents have submitted a modified version.
Okay.
I don't know to what extent this facility condition assessment is informing what the constituents applied, so that might have to be revisited.
Okay, I would just want to make sure that those two aren't happening separate from each other. I appreciate a constituent effort is going to be a little bit different, but it would be nice to kind of understand how those could potentially support each other if that's the direction the council decided to go.
Okay.
And I will also just add, as far as the gates go, it has always surprised me that there are not gates in terms of Liberty. Just knowing the other parks that I frequent, that has always been a surprise that there isn't anything that impedes traffic going through after hours, even though there's very clear signage that says the park is closed.
Yeah.
Councilmember Deegan.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is, these greenhouse gases, how did they get in such disrepair, and what is the actual use of the greenhouses? I'm not familiar with the greenhouses and the use, and how did they get into such a disrepair after so many years?
I'll turn it over to Kristen about the history of how the greenhouses got here. The greenhouses are used for propagation of plants that are then used for beautification, such as planters downtown or at other parks. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. This is Kristen. The greenhouses are used, as Ben said, for propagation of native plants. We started that program a couple years ago, and you'll find that the greenhouses are used really heavily in the spring when we purchase plants from local nurseries, and we take all those plants, put them in the greenhouse, care for them there until they all get planted. That's how it's used right now. And it also houses our greenhouse staff at Liberty Park. How did the greenhouse get to this point? I haven't been around that long, but the greenhouse has been in a not so good state for a very long time. And only small repairs have been done to it. It's got asbestos, it's got lead paint, and there's water damage that is creating structural issues, and we decided that between Public Services and us that we needed to do a assessment on the building to really understand if it was safe for our staff to be in there. And that recommendation came back that we should not have staff in that building any longer. So we pulled them out, and our concern is that it is shuttered and that it could attract some vandalism or people breaking in if we do nothing with it. So, and I wanted to answer Councilmember Young's question. We've been working with the constituent on that, and they do have an application in for the concept, and ours is for design.
Thank you very much. I just appreciate that the greenhouses are for our planting in our parks, in our public spaces, which is wonderful. Thank you.
Lua?
Sorry, just another note of history. I think it was just over 10 years ago or so that the city was going through some budget cuts. And one of the places that was cut during the annual budget was with the public services budget, when Public Lands was a part of that department. And I believe that some of the operations at the greenhouse and the maintenance of the building was suspended in order to meet some of those budget cuts instead of cutting staff positions, and that was never looked at to be restored once budget times changed. So there was some budget reduction history there that affected it.
I think this reinforces for me the need for a capital asset management plan. I don't like that we have an ongoing expense that we used to not have to now rent a spot, even if it doesn't seem very big. It's as big as an area median income, so I consider it a lot. And I don't like that it feels like we are accumulating historic properties that are, and this is a historic building, that we don't have a significant strategy for remediating. You are here at the tail end. I'm not faulting the administration is heralding some cans kicked down the road, but I really think our generation's responsibility as elected individuals is to get this bull by the horns and to create an asset management plan that does not put us in the place to have unexpected expenses if we can avoid it. The gates are strictly in response to the building being abandoned?
No, the gates are in response to after-hours use of the park, overnight camping in the park in vehicles, as well as vandalism in the park. We found that people are pulling up with their vehicles, opening up our light poles, taking the wire, attaching it to their bumper, and pulling it out. And then we don't have lights that work, and it's really expensive to repair.
And this is materially increased since the last budget period?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we've been working on this with PD, and basically it would just be the entrance that's closed, and then the exit would stay open, so if there are cars in there, they would have a way to leave. And we're also working with compliance to start issuing some tickets to folks that are there after hours.
Thank you. Council, any other comments? All right, Ben, let's keep moving.
Mary Beth reminded me there is one straw poll request, and I'll do that item next.
Thank you.
This is item I2. It's a housekeeping item to move CDBG dormant program income funds from the housing loan fund to the grant fund. It's $6.1 million total. There are 3 separate budgets within that $6.1 million. There's $5.6 million for property acquisition, $250,000 for the small business facade improvement program, and another $250,000 for west side sidewalks. The council previously approved those amounts and submitted it to HUD as a substantial amendment to the city's 5-year plan about how the city will use HUD grant funding. HUD approved that substantial amendment. This is not a legally required item, but it is a best practice in governmental accounting. Currently, there are non-federal housing loan funds being commingled with federal grant funds. So this move will better separate them. This is also a follow-up in the last budget amendment when you approved a grants administrator, FTE, in the finance department to enhance the oversight of federal grant programs in the city.
Ben, you said it's I2?
Correct.
We have no note about that in our staff report.
So I2 is on page 2 of the staff report. This was not in the
narrative
first.
portion.
Yeah, so if you go to the last page, it's not there in the I section. It's in the blue font new section on the second page.
Thank you for helping me find that.
Yep.
Okay, council, any questions? Yes, Councilmember Young.
I would just say, in general, I agree with the best practice of not commingling funds, especially when we're talking the difference between federal and then the city income components. So I would support taking this action to be able to clean up the accounting.
Okay.
All right, council members, who wants to propose the straw poll? Council.
I would like to propose that council, through a straw poll, supports the moving of CDBG dormant program income from the housing loan fund to the grants fund.
Show your feelings on that. All right. That is 5 of us in favor with Pui and Mono absent.
Okay. That takes us to A5. This is a request for $558,000 as a reappropriation of vacancy savings in the Public Lands Department. $333,000 would go to the Fleet Fund to purchase new equipment. This would be a mini excavator for irrigation system repairs and installations, and 2 wide area mowers. The Fleet Fund thinks that the time from ordering to delivery could be 18 months, which is why this is in a budget amendment. The other part of this item is $225,000 to contract temporary labor for essential maintenance in parks, on medians, and in the public right-of-way. The department stated that most full-time positions have been filled or will be filled soon. There is still ongoing challenges with recruitment and retention, including seasonal positions. The hourly rate for seasonal positions is $17.85 currently.
Council, feedback, requests?
I'll move on to A6. This is Fire Station Number 1 perimeter fencing. It would be $130,000 of fire impact fees, reimbursing the general fund for past eligible expenses. That $130,000 would then be used for this project. This project itself is not directly eligible for fire impact fees, but reimbursing the general fund for past expenses allows the funds to then be used for the project. Fire Station 1 is on the southeast corner of 500 East and 200 South. There are 2 driveways, one on 200 South, the other on 500 East. They connect in the back of the property in a parking lot. The parking lot is not well lit. It's perceived to be a bit secluded, and the issues that have been reported have been getting worse, which is why this is in a budget amendment. Some of the issues have been people cutting through the parking lot as a shortcut instead of waiting at the light, camping, and the police department has opened 14 cases in the last 4 years, including vehicle theft, prowling, and property theft. Chain link would be used for fencing the perimeter in the back of the property, and ornamental fencing would be used in the front, and gates would be put at both of the entrances. There was a CIP project last cycle, also at this fire station, to extend one of the bays so that it can house larger vehicles. So this fencing project could be combined with that apparatus bay extension, so you do one larger project, which is less disruption to the neighborhood and might have some potential cost savings.
Council? Okay, it appears we can go on.
Next up is A8. This is increasing the police overtime budget. It is a $1.8 million request from general fund balance. This would double the annual ongoing overtime budget for the police department. It's currently $1.8 million. This would increase it to $3.6 million. So the next annual budget would add in this $1.8 million for the police department's overtime budget ongoing. The administration stated most of the funds this year would go to mitigation officers. They would focus on reducing illegal camping, park safety, and the downtown safety initiative. There have been increasing uses of fund balance, and this is partially related to the temporary sanctioned campground and the county health department requests for cleanup. You might remember in the last budget amendment approving $500,000 from ARPA for police overtime at the temporary sanctioned campground for that need. As of late January, the actual overtime budget in the police department was $2.8 million of expenses. That's $1 million more than was budgeted, and vacancy savings have been used to cover that overage. The police department lapsed a relatively large amount to fund balance at the end of last fiscal year. It was over $7 million. They do not expect the same thing to happen at the end of this fiscal year because there's been increasing overtime usage, but they're also making significant progress to reach full staffing. As of 2 weeks ago, there were 21 vacant police officer positions and 11 vacant civilian positions. And in May is the next hire class. It's always a moving target. You never quite know when people are going to decide to leave employment, but this is the closest the department has been to reaching full staffing in probably over 3 years.
Council, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So it's clear that there's a need, and I understand like the circumstances around that need, and I am very glad that our Salt Lake City Police have made that happen. I do have pause because when we're talking about overtime, we're talking about individuals accruing that overtime and the stresses that that means for them in terms of both like time, mental energy, all of the above in terms of that. So I guess I'm just curious if there is a longer term plan related to, do we need additional FTE to be able to absorb those types of activities if we think that they are going to continue in the future? Because I would imagine at a certain point, there's not going to be individuals who want to participate in that overtime, and that could actually like shoot ourselves in the foot and lead to higher attrition.
Yeah. There have been times when the department has instituted mandatory overtime, which to your point, eventually burnout kicks in. Voluntary overtime has been used more often, but it's voluntary and sometimes the need goes unfilled. The department did share they're planning to submit a request for the Homeless Shelter Cities state grant, which currently pays for 2 squads, one at each of the homeless resource centers. This would be a 3rd squad for the permanent micro shelter that the state is developing at 750 West, 550 South. So that would add additional FTEs. It is subject to annual appropriation by the state. So there's already 17 FTEs that are paid by that grant. This would extend that even further. There's also the question for the city's budget. At what point does it make sense to hire FTEs instead of continuing to do the overtime? We can ask the administration if they've looked at that yet.
Yeah, and I don't need an answer related to this particular budget amendment, but I would like to raise the issue as we look ahead to the future budget.
Got it.
Thank you, Councilmember Young. Anyone else? All right, we can move on. I think we have time for maybe, would we like to do it now? I have it on 5:05 on the agenda. Would you like to do it now or 5:05? Okay, we have 5 minutes, Ben, and don't make me a liar to Angela. 5 minutes.
The next one, A11, is a request for $250,000 from general fund balance for repairs to 2 traffic signals that were damaged in accidents with non-city vehicles. One of these is at Gladiola in California, which was damaged when a semi-truck rolled over. The other is downtown, 200 West, 100 South, when a forklift hit the mast arm and partially spun the foundation of the pole. So these are significant damages to the point where the in-house technicians are unable to repair them. The best practice is for the repairs to be managed by the city, and then afterwards, when the true cost is known, RISC would go and talk to the insurance companies for full reimbursement. We don't know when the reimbursement would come in. It would probably be a future fiscal year, but it would go to the general fund to make it whole for fronting this repair cost.
Council members? Go ahead, Councilmember Young.
Do we have stoplights there right now?
I think temporary ones are being used. I don't know.
Jorge Chamorro is shaking his head yes passionately.
I would hope so.
Hi, Julie Crookston with Public Services. Our in-house technicians were able to temporarily repair the stop sign traffic signals so that they are functioning, but it is not a long-term repair and it is not deemed safe long-term either. So we want to hire outside help to do a full repair.
Got it. Thank you.
I actually have learned a lot because I just requested one in my district where the Boeing employees are experiencing some stress and we're having population growth in an unlikely place. I really think that as we're in this growth trajectory, it might benefit us to consider a policy outside of CIP for adding or maintaining traffic lights in a different way. It might be one of those things that maybe we need to get more proactive about. I know mine is like at least a year out and people are having car accidents today that justify it. So I would like to look at the overarching policy as we go through this too. Yes,
Madam Chair,
Councilmember Morrow.
sorry I wasn't here for the whole briefing, so maybe this already happened and I apologize. But is it the case that right now any new traffic signal or replacement traffic signal has to go through a CIP budget appropriation? We don't have the general budget to expand traffic signals?
When it comes to new traffic signals or a whole scale replacement, I believe it always goes through CIP. But when it's like ongoing maintenance, that's part of the ongoing budget for the department.
And are there impact fees that for new development in with new roads? No impact fees that can pay for traffic signals. Road impact fees cannot.
I don't think they're fully eligible. I think it's like a 10%. It's a relatively small amount. So
I'm with you, Madam Chair. Yeah. I'm with you on that because as we grow, even if we don't build new roads, but we have twice as many cars
traffic
using the
on
road,
existing roads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like a sort of whole scale look at what might need to be allocated in an annual budget for the.
Maybe that can be a priority during budget season to see if there's a more proactive way to handle it. Thank you.
We can track that for the next CIP cycle. Transportation does have an ideal funding level to say, a traffic signal should last, 50 years, but that means we need to fund replacements of this number every year. We have not been meeting that for the last decade.
Like some sort of projection based on population growth, traffic pattern increases. Is there a way to project how many new signals a year we might need to invest in that are whole scale new? It's no one's fault here. This is the process we have established. But we already have enough traffic accidents at the place in my district to justify needing a signal today, and we're 18 months out from being able to get it. That's really difficult to tell people, hey, for 18 more months, risk your insurance premiums to get to and from work.
I think the timing might be fortuitous that the transportation section of the impact fee plan is currently being updated. So you could ask the administration to include this as one of the costs when calculating transportation impact fees under the new plan.
Council members, how do you feel about that? I don't want to hijack this conversation with my anecdotal experience.
No, as long as we include the roundabouts in that discussion.
Yeah. We want to go European. We want more roundabouts. But like legit roundabouts potentially, okay? Not the small one that's on 13 West of 500
I just
North.
said if we're going to think about traffic lights, new traffic lights, we should think about new roundabouts.
It's going to take a lot of driver education in our area of the world, but once we learn it, it could potentially get better.
Well, people would learn what counterclockwise is.
That's right.
And clockwise.
Okay. That is 5:05, Ben and team. Thank you for honoring that boundary and letting us ask lots of questions. We'll see you next meeting to finish this up.
There's only a few items left.
Thank you. Okay. We're going to turn the time over to everyone's favorite Legislative Affairs Director, Angela Price, making us look good up on the Hill every day.
Thank you. I love that intro.
So much love and light in it.
So much love and light. We need that right now, right? I believe Kate is joining us online. We had quite a few bills in committee this afternoon, so we're dividing and conquering. Angela Price, Legislative Affairs Director. Happy to be with you guys. I will try to get through these fairly quickly. We have 8 business days left. Not that we're counting, but we are. The city's currently tracking 277 bills, which is a lot less than last year. So we're really excited about the refinements of our legislative tracking process. We're currently working over 20 bills, and that's as of last Friday. That doesn't include all of the really big bills that have dropped yesterday and today. And then we have 17 bills that we're monitoring, which means that we've already worked them for amendments, but we're watching them to make sure that nothing weird gets added into them. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we just kind of have on our radar as it's moving through committee to make sure things don't get tacked onto it. The revenue numbers came out on Friday, so just want to quickly touch on that. They are more stabilized and consistent than we thought they were going to be, which is really good. There is a decrease in ongoing general funds that could impact appropriations, but I know we are watching closely for the homelessness and housing appropriations, so these revenue numbers are positive in that regard, but we still have an uphill battle there. The really big bill that dropped this afternoon, which we've all been reading about in the paper, is the Utah Fair Park Area Investment and Restoration, HB 562. It literally just dropped a few hours ago, so we're analyzing that, and I know many people are looking closely at that bill. Is Kate on, Cindy Lou? No? Okay. I was just going to tag her in if she wanted to say anything before I kept moving on. Housing and homelessness, the Chamber and the Downtown Alliance held a press event this morning with multiple businesses asking for the legislature to fund Governor Cox's homelessness appropriations. That was a really, really great press event. There was a lot of discussion about Salt Lake City and the positive impacts that we're having since we've had the winter overflow beds open. So I encourage you to watch for the media coverage on that. The Chamber had a letter signed by over 60 different businesses supporting Governor Cox's homelessness appropriations. And then the Council of Mayors has also signed on to a letter that's signed by all of 3 mayors that will be presenting to leader. Hello? Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. That will be presenting to leadership and the Executive Appropriations Committee. And the 3 mayors that haven't signed just weren't at the meeting. That's not that they were in opposition to it. This morning, Representative Clancy's homelessness bill, HB 298, passed out of Senate committee. There is an additional amendment to that bill that is something that the city supports, which would be adding an opportunity for a provider to be on the Homeless Council. So we were really pleased with that additional amendment there. HB 421, homelessness amendments. This is Representative Ellison's bill. He has a 3rd sub that we're analyzing to understand impacts to the city. And then I've been teeing this up for a couple of weeks for you, specifically your questions on home ownership. We had 2 bills, one dropped yesterday afternoon and one this morning, that will create funding opportunities for housing. And sorry, this mic seems like it's cutting out a little bit. I hope you guys can hear me okay. The first is HB 572, State Treasurer's Investment Amendments. This is Representative Spenlove. And if you want me to say that bill number again, Councilmember Mano, I'm happy to repeat that. Okay, good. And again, this just dropped, so we're still analyzing, but it creates an additional funding opportunity for home ownership and affordable home ownership opportunities. And then the second one that was released today is from Senator Harper, and this is SB 268, First Time Homeowner Zone. And this builds off of the housing transit reinvestment concept that passed, I want to say, 2 sessions ago. And again, it's really heavily focused on home ownership and affordability, being able to leverage tax increment from a sending and a receiving zone. So we're digging into those bills, and we'll be able to give you guys some more information on those as we are able to analyze them. onto religious freedom. Dave Quayle, the Legislative Affairs Attorney, testified this morning on SB 150. This is Senator Weiler's exercise of religion amendments. This is a bill that the city is really concerned with. We've been grateful to the senator for working with Salt Lake City and allowing us to be at the table. We still have some additional amendments that we're hoping that we can get included. The Utah League of Cities and Towns is also concerned about this bill, so we're continuing to work with our partners and with the sponsor on this bill. The other bill that we're watching closely is HB 396, Workplace Discrimination Amendments. And then just quickly on to a couple different energy bills. I know there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of different energy bills moving and a lot of requests from the city to support or oppose different energy bills. So I just wanted to quickly touch on these. HB 374 is Representative Jack's bill, and we are in opposition to this bill, and we're still monitoring it very closely. SB 214 is Senator Hinkins. We are monitoring this bill and seeing where this may go over the next few days. And then the last one is SB 224 from Senator Sandel, and we are working with the sponsor on amendments for this bill. So happy to answer any questions that you have. I say there's 8 days left. We had some of the biggest bills of the session drop in the past 24 hours. So our team, not just the legislative affairs team, but all of us are going to be working really hard over the next 8 days to ensure that we get the best possible outcome from this session.
Thank you, Angela. Council, any questions? Reminder that everyone has access to Angela on Friday afternoons. Please take advantage of that. Councilmember Dugan.
Angela, on the Hinkins Bill 214, has that had a few substitutions or been anything on that one? Because I know it was kind of very slim.
Yeah, there has not been a sub on that yet. We have been hearing there might be, so we're watching that closely.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Angela, thanks for keeping us all moving in the same direction. You're remarkable, and as is your team. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
You as well. Okay, so we have a nice group. Online, we should be joined by Alex Van Diver and Chloe Raimundo. In person, we should have Deetria Taylor, Dia Uman, Heather Stringfellow, Jason Hinojosa, and Rodrigo Fernandez Esquivias, which is such a good name. All right, if you are here in person, please feel free to come up here and take a seat at the front. If you're online, we're going to try to get you queued up so we can see you. All of the people in front of us are here for an appointment to the Racial Equity in Policing Commission. So we'd like to give each of you just 1 minute or so to introduce yourself, why you're interested in serving on this commission. And let's privilege the online people just for a second, all right? So let's see, I see Chloe first. Chloe, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. My name is Chloe Raimundo, and I have interest in this committee because I would like to see something done about some of the policing issues in Utah, and I'd also like to applaud all of the strides forward that we've made.
Thank you so much. We'll next go to Alex.
Hi, my name is Alex Van Diver. I'm an attorney.
Oh, hang on 1 second, Alex. We can't hear you so well.
Oh, that might be me. Can you hear me better now?
That's so much better. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, my microphone isn't the best. My name is Alex Van Diver. I'm an attorney over at Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer. I have a big passion for community improvement, specifically Salt Lake City. I've grown up here. I've been here for all 30 years of my short life, and I want to continue to see my community grow. So that's my interest in becoming part of the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And then we'll go to Deetria.
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Deetria Taylor. I am interested in joining this commission because specifically I was living in Los Angeles when the George Floyd, everything went on with that, and I was really interested in all that stirred up. and I wanted to have a voice and make a difference. But I moved to Salt Lake City, and when I saw this commission existed, I thought, wow, what a great way to contribute and help, just basically help.
Thank you so much. And then we'll turn to the table. We can start over here and work our way down. Can you make sure the green light's on? There you go.
I'm Heather Stringfellow, and I am interested in serving on the commission because public health and safety is my passion. I actually started my long-term career as an officer with Salt Lake City Police Department and a sex crime. And, ooh, this mic is kind of finicky. Anyway, I've been out of the police department for about 20 years now, and am just really interested in giving my time and talent and contributing my lived experience in the critical work of creating racial equity and policing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jason Inahosa. I am actively in law enforcement. This is my 30th year in law enforcement. And the reason I want to be on this committee or this commission is to bring my experiences, my lived experiences in and out of law enforcement, both the good and the bad, and be part of bringing around real reform. I've started doing that in my position at the University of Utah. I'm currently a captain there. I currently sit on the Staff Council Committee for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I'm also on an advisory committee for equity, diversity, inclusion to the Faculty Senate. Now that's at the university, and I would really very much be interested in bringing my experiences and any knowledge I have to this body so that we can make some real difference in law enforcement. Thank you.
My name is Dia Uwin. I am a senior at West High. I was actually on the commission, took a quick break, here to join back again. Mostly interested because I go to a high school and I see the impact on students in my daily life.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I'm a freshman at the University of Utah studying political science with a minor in human rights and resources. I served on the youth city government and actually presented the youth state of the city a couple of months ago in front of you all, so it's good to see you again. And recently I've been worried about the anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that are being passed in our legislature. And I heard about this commission through a friend, and I've heard of all the great work that you've done. So it really is just my honor to be able to interview for a position to safeguard equity, especially when it comes to policing, seeing as 2023 was one of the deadliest years for homicides at the hands of law enforcement agents, and how that especially impacts Black Americans more than anybody else. So yeah, I'm just honored to be able to give my knowledge of political science through my university degree and yeah, just help serve the community.
Thank you so much. I really love when we do things that don't plan to do things, but actually do them in the execution. Like we have generational diversity, we have racial and ethnic diversity before us, we have experiential diversity. It's really, really exciting to see us doing the thing, not planning to possibly one day do the thing. So anyone else have any feedback, comments, remarks? Intense gratitude from anyone who happens to represent you. Councilmember Mano.
I just want to say thank you, especially to some of the familiar faces that we continue to see engaging with our city in so many different ways, and it's really inspiring. So thank you so much.
So none of you have to show up this evening. You'll be on our consent agenda, and once that's done, you will be welcomed in, and thank you for caring about the city and your neighbors in the city enough to give your time and energy to this. Thank you. All right. Report of the chair or vice chair. Vice chair, do you have anything? All right. Executive director, anything? Well, deputy executive. Okay, council, I've asked to do a brief, 10-minute closed session for the purpose of discussion regarding deployment of security personnel, devices, or systems, and attorney-client matters. Can I get a motion to enter that closed session, please?
Madam Chair, I move that we go into closed session for the purpose of receiving advice on attorney-client privileges, and also for the deployment of security resources, personnel, or systems.
Second.
I've got a motion from Councilmember Horton, a second from Dugan. Any discussion? We'll roll call. Young?
Aye.
Pui?
Aye.
Mono?
Aye.
Wharton?
Aye.
Lopez Chavez?
Aye.
Dugan?
Aye.
And I'm affirmative. That is unanimous. We are now in closed session.
Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of Capital City News. We're here in front of City Hall. There's a helicopter above me for some reason, and it's freezing. We've got this week a major mayor announcement, an interesting history minute, but first, our look backs and our look aheads.
In Salt Lake City, we believe in access and inclusion for every person who lives in or visits our city. To that end, we've partnered with a visual interpreting service to assist blind and low vision residents and visitors in navigating the visual world around them. With a download of the Aira app, available on Android or iOS, a live trained visual interpreter will be your visual assistant for whatever you need for as long as you need for free in city-sponsored service areas. So whether you're ordering drinks, meeting your ride, or checking out an event in Liberty Park, Salt Lake City aims to make it all the more efficient, more enjoyable, and more accessible to everyone.
On behalf of the Future Host Commission, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the decision today. The Executive Board today followed the recommendation of the Future Host Commission to invite